To adopt the revised agenda and tabled items. Agreed. Apologies. Is Militia not coming in today?
Oh, he's there. He's on Spotlight.
Oh, is it? Militia, can you hear us?
Hold up. Marion, can you add Melissa to the Spotlight? Sorry. Here we go. Hold on. Just make sure he's on. Okay, ask him now.
Brilliant. Okay. Militia, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Excellent. And Pat, where's Matthew today?
He's always late.
He's going to join us by Starleaf, I think. So,
is he?
Yeah, but he's not with us yet.
Okay. Well, brilliant. Has we received any notice from any member to delegate authority to other members of the committee, Clark?
Nope.
Nope. Okay. Any declarations of interest? Nope. Right, next item on the agenda, the budget and other policy challenges. We'll now receive oral evidence from the Minister on the budget and other policy challenges. This evidence session will be reported by Hansard.
Here's outside, just coming in.
Excellent.
Okay. We'll just continue. That's okay.
What's the issue?
We're just not sure that we're broadcasting. We think we are, but
come on in, Connor.
Morning or afternoon.
Afternoon. Hi, Colin.
Steve, how you doing?
Not too bad. How'd your Joanne? Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Team, this is a great opportunity for us to talk to our Minister about some of the pertinent issues that we have, including the issues to do with the budget and other issues we've got going in the department, and I'm sure it will be fairly wide-ranging. Minister, I've sort of already pre-briefed the team that you'll get about 3 questions each from us. Okay. So, but I didn't define how long it's going to be. No doubt Militia will sort of come in at some stage if he thinks it's going too long, which he normally does. But it's a good opportunity for us to have an end of the year gather up about where we are and where we're likely to go to as well. Team, the Clerk's briefing notes, page 24. Connor's ministerial statement of the draft budget is page 33. Ministerial written statement on 22-25, funding available is at page 56. The Department of Finance's response regarding NICS reform is at page 73. The written ministerial statement RHI inquiry reports on 86. And the Department of Finance response regarding the LRSSS legislation is at page 180. Minister, you are very welcome to the Committee for Finance. I would like to thank you again for providing the Deputy Chairperson and I with an informal briefing on Monday of the draft budget. That was very appreciated. And could I invite you to make your opening remarks?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Chair, for the invitation. And I'll try and keep the opening remarks brief because I know the members will probably get more value in terms of the question and answer session. I have, as you have said, Colin Boyle with me, the Permanent Secretary, and Joanne McBurney is our Public Spending Director. And of course, any questions of detail or difficulty will be picked up by them as opposed to myself. Okay. There's a couple of areas I know that you had particularly looked at, and I'll just make some opening remarks in relation to those. Firstly, the budget. Since the last time I was with the committee, we set out the spent review outcome from the 27th of October, with the implications of that for public finances. And last week, the Executive agreed to consult on a draft budget. And earlier this week, as you have said in your opening remarks, I announced that to the Assembly and had a conversation with yourself and the Deputy Chair. The budget, as you know, is the first multi-annual budget announcement in 10 years, and that obviously helps us with planning, but it doesn't give us the quantum of allocation that we would have needed to do all of the things that we would like to do. And the impact of 10 years of austerity budgets is still being felt across public services. So while the 3-year span in terms of being able to plan ahead is very much welcome, we certainly would have wanted a much better outcome. I think we said it wasn't as bad as we anticipated, but it certainly was not as good as we had hoped for. And of course, particularly, as you will know, the health service is under a particular level of pressure, but there are other areas, skill shortages, increased wage costs, supply shortages, still struggling to return to pre-pandemic trading levels, cost of living crisis, result rising food and energy costs, the increase in national insurance and the cut to universal credit by the government in London, and of course COVID and its various variants are a constant source of pressure. So the budget outcome, as I said on Monday in my statement and in the written statement last Thursday, I think, or last Friday, from our perspective, prioritises health. It directs 2% of other departments' baselines to health. Provides support for businesses and households through freezing the regional rate. Specific support for businesses with a 1-month rates holiday and 3-month holiday for specific sectors, and that you'll have had conversations with officials, I think, again later on in this meeting in relation to coronavirus rates legislation. So that announcement was agreed on Friday at the Executive, but it's continued to be a challenging time, right, and it will be a challenging time over the next 3 years. So I think that we have to make best possible use of the resources we have. We have to prioritise. The budget that I proposed attempted to put, if you like, a fit to the declared prioritisation of the Executive in relation to health, not just in terms of we have a real responsibility to try and resolve public health and make sure we look to the health of our own population, but also in terms of the cost of health has been over the last 10 years and that continued growth in health spend. This is an opportunity for the Executive to try and put some reforms in place, to try and bring down some of the acute problems within health in terms of waiting lists, in terms of cancer services and mental health services, some of the key priorities that I don't doubt all MLAs have mentioned at some stage or other over the last 2 years, and to try and get some, if you like, some measure of control and direction in terms of future health spending, or in 3 years' time, and from my perspective, and it may not be me as a Finance Minister, but in 3 years' time we'll be having a conversation with health that's eating up even more of our public finances than it currently is. And I think so there's an imperative on the Executive to make that prioritisation for that particular point of view. And of course the committee will be consulted, and we very look forward to hearing the committee's views over that consultation period in relation to the budget. And I know the Fiscal Council will also be making some commentary in relation to that, so we look forward to that and the public consultation. It was important for us to get the budget out in a timely fashion because it is the first multi-annual budget in a decade. There is an onus on us to ensure the public have an opportunity to have a say, and as you know, it crosses the Christmas holiday period, so that's in effect some time lost to people. So it was important to get that out and to get the fullest extent possible of public consultation, and we look forward to the return of that. I will continue to discuss, and we're happy to discuss with the committee, but we'll certainly continue to discuss with Executive colleagues the pressures that they're facing and how we can do that. We did a number of those discussions, and we made some alterations to the paper before. I think we were in version 4 when we finally got the paper through the Executive last week, and that was a consequence of a discussion with Executive colleagues about some of the pressures they were facing and how we might be more flexible in terms of our approach to some specific issues. And so we continue to do that before it gets to a point where the Executive is asked to agree a final budget and then go to legislate in the Assembly. And of course the Assembly has its say then in relation to all of that. Just in relation to annual reports and accounts, and also something that the committee, so just to be able to provide further updates since the briefing on the 10th of November, the Controller and Auditor General has concluded that the audit opinions qualified on 3 matters: regularity qualification as a result of ineligible payments made under LRSS, limitation of the scope qualification as a result of multiple grants paid to business under the additional finance assistance schemes, and true and fair qualification regarding the misclassification of potential year-end commitments relating to COVID business grant schemes. So it's an exceptional situation which the Department was operating, and that was acknowledged by the Controller and Auditor General, and obviously we will continue to engage with him and with yourselves in relation to these matters. On the non-rates revaluation or non-domestic rates revaluation coronavirus bill, I know the officials are coming up to you subsequent to our discussion, but we have obviously written to you on the 3rd of November. Since the 3rd of November, we've written, I think, on 3 occasions trying to address some of the questions that have arisen through the committee, and I welcome the onus, by the way, that the committee and the focus that they've put in terms of processing this piece of legislation. I know we had the debate on accelerated passage. That's the only device available to me to try and make sure legislation is done in time, but the committee have the ability, if they agree, to do their own scheduling of that, and I welcome very much the focus that's been put on that by the committee. The LPS, since that 3rd November, LPS officials have been in contact with stakeholders to explain the rationale for the legislation and answer some of their questions. I had a round table with main business stakeholders as well on the 18th of November. We briefed the Association of Local Government Finance Officers, and the bill, of course, does offer certainty for district councils in setting their rates next year. And I met senior representatives from District Council at the at the Executive Local Government Engagement Forum on the 25th of November. The last issue I think that you'd wanted to discuss was the RHI outworkings, and obviously the inquiry did highlight a number of systemic failings in a range of areas, including access to expertise, programme management, communication, resourcing, management of risk and the business case process. And you've had an opportunity obviously to analyse as a committee the Executive's response to the RHI inquiry. When you'll be aware that we have had revisions of the Code of Conduct for Ministers and Special Advisers, and discussion on those predated actually the Executive coming back and were part of the new Decade New Approach Agreement. The new rules for Special Advisers were published in January 2020 and the new rules for Ministers in March that year. And then following publication of the RHI inquiry report, work began as to how the Executive would respond through the subcommittee. We agreed a consolidated report to go to the Executive, and the themes identified in the RHI inquiry around which the Executive's response is described, they will continue to be themes for reform going forward. So those issues that were identified and that we have reported on will now form the basis of ongoing work. We will be working with the new head of the Civil Service to drive reform within the civil service, and in that context we've agreed a memorandum of understanding between the Department of Finance and the Executive Office, making sure there's clarity about respective roles and responsibilities, and committing both teams to work together on this important agenda. The work of reform is, particularly in a large organisation like the civil service, has to take a number of different forms, and we have to change policies and rules, but real change in practice requires leadership at both head of civil service and senior civil service level, but also in terms of executive ministers as well, and that's where that will begin with both ministers and permanent secretaries. So that will be a programme for work. I know you've had an opportunity to speak to the new head of civil service previously, but we are very committed to working with her on this, and I think we have established a basis of understanding as to how we will work, because I'm responsible in terms of answering to the Executive in terms of civil service matters, but the head of the civil service has responsibility and the Executive Office have responsibility, so we need to make sure that we're working in tandem with each other, and that's what the MOU has been about, to make sure that we can bring forward, and that will be based on the themes that emerge from the inquiry about competency, about correct skills, the right people in the right places, the right measures to make sure decision making is supported, and that essentially that the lessons from that inquiry are learnt. So that's just a very brief skip through some of those, Chair. I'm very happy to take questions, and of course we have Colin and Joanne here as well to pick up on any.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister, and thank you very much indeed for that overview. I just want to concentrate first of all on the issues of the budget, and it's good that we've actually got a draft budget that's gone out for consultation. But I think we're all aware of the tensions that are behind the scenes within the Executive, and we're looking to the point where we get some form of, hopefully get some form of agreement. So can you give us the idea of the timeline as when you're expecting it to come back to the Executive for agreement, and what happens if the Executive don't agree to it at that point, and where that's going to leave us?
Well, we're essentially working back from the end date, which is, I think, the 25th of March, is whenever we go into Purda. I thought it was the 28th, but somebody tells me it's the 25th, but in and around that week. So we've been working backwards to do the legislative process, the consultation process, and the draft budget being put out there. And it's understandable if we are to make health a priority, which we have always said health is a priority. We have a 3-year opportunity now to not only fix some of the things that are wrong in health, but actually fix some of the things which contribute to the significant increase in cost of health. Then that's going to, and we have a finite budget, which is not what we had wanted in terms of what our public services need. So that's going to mean challenges to other ministers. Now, in some ways, and I'd said this at an executive just planning discussion, we all have the luxury of taking off our ministerial hats because we are setting a budget for the incoming Executive. We may not be re-elected, but we may not be in the positions that we're currently in, even if we are re-elected. So we should try and face into this as a collective Executive, as kind of leaders within our own 5-party structure that's sitting in the Executive, to say what is best in the longer-term interest over the 3 years for people that we represent. But of course, it's undoubted that ministers will come in with some of the departmental issues that they know are pressure, some of the things they wanted to do in the department, some of the things they're passionately committed to, and they know that in the sense of a 2% contribution to health over an efficiency saving over a period of time, that does present challenges, because it's not just this is the end effect of 10 years of austerity, which means that services are cut to the bone. So we recognise those pressures. So it's not a surprise that there is that presents a challenge, and in the executive discussions that presents a challenge. And as I say, the paper we presented last Friday was the 4th iteration of the paper that we brought, and that was a change process brought about by discussion with executive colleagues as to some flexibility is required, some new ways of looking at things, the idea of trying to max out in terms, particularly in capital, other assistance for capital budgets. So we did get an agreement. It wasn't a complete agreement, but we got an agreement required for consultation. No one is asked at this stage, as an executive minister, to put their hand up for a budget. They're asked to put a budget out for consultation. The final decision on the budget comes at that end point, which I think is mid-February, at the end of the 12th consultation.
Consultation ends on the 7th of March, but we'll be obviously engaging before that.
Yeah.
So hopefully we're at a final point.
So it's in around that period, and then we will be bringing a final paper for agreement, because then you're into the legislative process in Assembly, which is a fixed time frame as well, which we need to complete before the end of March. If there's no agreement on that, I mean, there are very real consequences to no agreement. Firstly, in terms we have to agree a budget, because even before the next executive is formed, spend will be incurred in the new financial year. Yeah. So we have to ensure that spend can be carried out. So I think, I mean, this is always a difficult matter. There are a lot of issues which a lot of elected representatives and elected ministers.
If you could just sort of to brief the committee, what do you think the sort of, if we don't sign off on the budget, what will the tensions?
Well, I don't really contemplate that being an issue. We do have to. We are required to get a budget through the Assembly by an end date. So that's a legal requirement of us to do that. And so I would expect that's the case. But I do accept that there is a challenge in that, because I think people are passionate about a range of issues. But we have always said that health is the #1 priority. From my perspective, the budget that I have presented supports that, actually puts resource to health being the #1 priority over the next number of years. And actually, I think there's an imperative on us, even in looking at public finances from that perspective, of actually doing something which makes sure that we try to get a grip on the costs of provision of health.
Okay, thanks, Minister. Next question. You'll have read, I think, as we have all done avidly in this committee, both the report from the Independent Fiscal Council and the Independent Fiscal Commission. And I think if you read on page 9 of the executive summary of Independent Fiscals Commission, it doesn't read very well for the management of what we've been doing with public finances in Northern Ireland for a very long time. You as a minister reading that, what did you feel about how we've been mismanaging our entire process over the last sort of decade and beyond? And as a minister, looking forward, what do you think we should be doing to put it right?
Well, I think, firstly, the Fiscal Commission report was reflecting a lot of the, I mean, they went out and consulted with people, so they were reflecting people's view.
And specifically, sort of, one of the things was the letter from the Treasury. I think we're asking to see that letter from the Treasury that they wrote back to you, the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, which indicated that they weren't happy to fully engage with the Commission because we weren't capable of managing our finances.
Well, see, to be quite honest, that's nonsense. And the fact is that because there was not a full agreement in the Executive for a Fiscal Commission to be established and produce this report, the NIO, then running interference as is their want, advised Treasury that they shouldn't cooperate with the Fiscal Commission. And they have cooperated to a significant degree, albeit it could improve. The issue about the financial stability and sustainability of the executive finances was exactly the phrase used in terms in 2014 when we talked about transferring corporation tax, that they want to see a sustainability, they want to see a fiscal council. There is a fiscal council there now. It wasn't my gift to do it between then and now. As soon as I got into office, we did put in place the process for establishing a fiscal council. But to be quite honest, this idea that they won't engage because they don't think there's a capacity to do any of these things is frankly nonsense, because they have engaged with Scotland and Wales, and I'm sure they had the same concerns in relation to that when they started out. I mean, a lot of the same arguments. And the fiscal, I spoke with the Fiscal Commission.
Back to the Minister?
Sorry?
Have you written back to them?
To the
Secretary of the Treasury?
I've spoken to him directly about this issue. I said to him that all parties have engaged with the Fiscal Commission, that the advice that they were given at the outset of it, that it was something that was contentious and maybe shouldn't be engaged with by Treasury, was nonsense, and it was given to them by NIO. and I have said to them that they should collaborate, that this was an academic exercise. It was to inform an incoming executive. Nothing can happen in these issues unless an incoming executive, which would require cross-community support, decides that this is a good idea to go with. Then that opens up a period of negotiation with Treasury. And then by the time you would get to a point where something is done in this regard, now it should have happened many years back in my opinion, but by the time you get to something's done, you're probably talking about the latter end of the next mandate. And that would require a whole load of checks and balances to go through. So the idea that we wouldn't want to inform ourselves for such a debate, for me, is ludicrous. Surely we would want access to all the information and inform ourselves. It's then up to the Executive and the Assembly to decide whether they want to process that, but I don't see how they would decide how to process it if they don't have access to all the information. After my discussion with the Chief Secretary of Treasury, there was information provided. I think there could be more, and I intend to pick that discussion up with them again.
Okay. And just again, with the Fiscal Commission, I mean, I must admit, when I read the report, I was like, I don't know what many other members of the committee were thinking, but I was expecting a bit more even at the interim report. Now, I understand the issue about income tax and landfill tax and the rest of it, but it seemed to pull its punches on significant questions to do with issues to do with what we call the super parity issues, and there wasn't real discussion to look at those and how we look at those. Were you a bit disappointed as well, or are you expecting them to address some of those issues as we go forward, or do you just think they're going to stick to what they say is the income tax issues and I think it's the 5 or 6 issues that they let out on the table?
Well, firstly, I didn't give them any steer in relation to their work. And I think that was important, because I think some of the reticence in establishing the Commission might have been that they thought that we were going to direct it in a particular way, and we clearly didn't give them any direction other than the broad terms of reference. We didn't give them any particular direction to look at any particular areas, and they were free to come up with what they wished. This is an interim report. Part of it was to stimulate a discussion with people, because there hasn't been that type of debate and discussion here really for 20 years, and there should have been. So part of that was to try and do a bit of stimulation around ideas. So, I mean, I'm not either surprised or disappointed or anything. I think they did a valuable piece of work, and I think there's more to be developed from it. And I would encourage people between now and they produce a final report to engage with them. I think that gives you a very solid platform for engagement with them in relation to what they're suggesting. And bear in mind, it isn't a plan that they're giving us, it's a report. It's a report on what is possible and what it would look like and what it might mean. It will be for the democratic institutions here then to take that and decide to move forward with it. If they agree with some of it, all of it, none of it, it will be a matter of democratic choice beyond that.
Okay. And the final one for me, we'll just move on to the RHI issue. Look, we've had a lot of information that's come to this committee, but there's some information that we haven't received, which hasn't enabled us to come to the full conclusions that we need to do. And we will be encouraging the department to provide us and furnish us with that information, because we have worked quite closely before in other areas of sensitivity, but we haven't got that information. And I'm not going to go into that particular area now, but there's one particular part about the RHI piece that surprised me a bit, in that we saw correspondence from a member of your department in 2018 to the RHI inquiry team, pointing out the various things that were already being done. Were being done by the Senior Civil Service, were being done by the board. There was an entire annex of issues that they were undertaking and indicated that they were being undertaken. Fast track now to 2021, and it's quite obvious that they haven't happened. And I don't think it's you as the Minister who's been handed with the responsibility to make sure that the lessons identified from RHI are dealt with. How can you be sure that the civil service is actually fit for purpose to be able to deliver what it has to be able to deliver? Because quite clearly we saw in 2018, I think it was Mr. Pawley's wrote to the inquiry, and he laid out in quite detail about issues that were already been going and happening, and this was happening. And then we've had information that's come later, and it's still being discussed, and it still hasn't been implemented, and we're close on 2022, I suppose it's going to be. So there's been a 4-year gap there. What do you think is the impediment to be able to make real cultural change in the civil service? Because it just doesn't seem to be happening. Well,
firstly, in relation to the information sharing, my position has always been to give the committee as much information as we can possibly give them, because I'm a former committee chair of the Finance Committee, and to give as much information. That's always been my position. That's obviously balanced against legal advice and duty of care, particularly when it comes to individuals and their disciplinary matters attached to them and their career potential or whatever, there is a duty of care within the civil service to people that they employ. And so we have to balance that with that. So I have continuously tested, and I've been back and forward with the committee in relation to that, the legal advice, and it's only where a very, very clear legal advice and advice in terms of HR and duty of care to people that I would consider holding anything back from the committee in that regard, and that's the basis on which the information has been shared. In relation to, I mean, in 2018, I'm trying to remember back the dates, but I know that prior to the executive coming back, there was a work stream in one of our 5 work streams which were looking at the issues which were emerging from the RHI inquiry at that time. And I think Bill Pawley, actually, along with Sue Gray, serviced that. I know Sue kind of chaired that dialogue, but I'm almost certain, I wasn't on that group, but some of you may have been, but I'm almost certain Bill Pawley acted as a service to that dialogue stream. So it's quite possible there were issues being identified as they were arising in the inquiry, and people were saying if the executive gets back into place, which we were all striving to do, these are some of the issues we need to tackle. Some of the first issues that were brought to me, certainly when I come back, were issues around ministerial code, special advisors, code of conduct. Those seem to be the acute issues from and then there were longer term systemic change issues in terms of the civil service, and that work's ongoing. So I'm not aware that there's been a hiatus or an impediment in relation to any of that work. I know that we are focused on it. We've had, I suppose, since the last permanent head of the civil service, we've had interim arrangements, and we're now back only in recent times to a new permanent head of the civil service. So whether that has acted as a brake on things, or perhaps things not developing as quickly as they can, but I do know that the head of the civil service now, alongside ourselves, and the Executive Office, are keen to press ahead with that wider reform piece within the service. I know there are a number of streams identified. Work has been done on some of them, and maybe Colin can pick up on some of those broad headlines. But I'm not aware, and haven't been since coming into the department, that we've been trying to press ahead with things and we're running into roadblocks or diversions or things having a dead hand put on them within the department. But maybe Colin can pick up on some of the streams that have been happening, particularly in relation to the civil service reform piece.
Yeah. So just picking up on that, if there's any consolation to the committee, NIAO are also looking at this. So we had the draft of the RHI action plan. They wanted to go through that. They also have a version of it where they've gone through it recommendation by recommendation and all the sub-recommendations in that. So it's been quite a painstaking review of it. They had done a piece on that just a bit earlier this year. I went through it with Bill and Bill's team about 2 months ago or 6 weeks ago. A lot of the stuff in terms of where NIAO had taken an angle or a perspective on it, it's out of date. So there's quite a bit has happened actually, and for me, NIAO are the acid test of this, because they're going to look at this very, very forensically. So we do meet again with them at the beginning of January to go back through it, because we provided them with our update on that. They will go back through that with us collectively again. So I have no question that will come here. As I say, they've done it very much on an item by item basis rather than a thematic as how we've looked at it. So we're just trying to group things together. But just to pick up on Minister's point there about is there any dead hand in any of this? There's not. I think there's been a delay in getting the RH action plan onto the executive at one stage. I think there are various streams which are probably quite complicated running alongside each other as well. So I know we've made really good progress across a number of departments with project management capability and setting up project management offices and so on. The whole commercial dimension of that's kicking along very nicely as well. Policy piece, I know that Dennis McMahon and the team are working very, very hard on that, and Dennis in his role as head of professions, very, very focused on delivering on that. The HR piece is the one I think I'm most focused on myself, trying to really kick it on further and faster, because we know on the foot of the RHI action plan and the RHI report, we also have the capacity and capability angle, and I know that Jill and her team have been looking at this whole process of breaking down those recommendations from that and looking at right person, right job, right time. So we know that we need to sharpen that up, and we have 3 separate reviews going on in that space, which will feed into where capacity and capability wants us to go, and which will also, I think, feed into a number of the recommendations around RHI. Critical point for me is we want to be able to make sure, from a recruitment point of view or a selection point of view, we're putting the best people into the job rather than putting people into the job as pretty much blank slates and then having to train them up for a very, very long time. So we're trying to create that mix and match as to how we do it. Very, very difficult when we're a grade-based organisation and we're used to bringing people in at staff officer grade and they go wherever, but there's more of a nuance in that now in terms of job roles, and I think that's what we need to see coming forward as well. So we need a mixed economy between job roles and grade-based recruitment, and that's the direction of travel that we're going in. Not an easy delivery as a one big thing and saying you've got that done. You've got to grow that organically, because given the size of the civil service and given the capacity of the HR actually and the limited bandwidth they have to take on board and service all of those roles, because there's a lot in there, a lot of different professions across the service as well. So I'm not making excuses for it. What I'm actually saying is it is slow in parts, but it's very complicated and very broad in parts as well.
Okay, thanks very much indeed.
Mr. Wells.
Jim?
Right. They want me to sign. Sorry.
It's not like you.
No, I've got some papers to sign here involving a lot of money, so sorry about that. Two questions, Minister.
Is that our pension, Jim, is it?
It is your pension, it is. As the chair of a fund worth £42 million, I have to look after it, which is only a drop in the bucket, of course, as far as these gentlemen are concerned. First of all, one immediate, and you'd expect me to ask you this, things have moved on even since you were last, and Colin was last before this committee, in terms of our current coronavirus situation. And as we said to you the last time, your department and Department of the Economy were extraordinarily generous and efficient. I don't quote this in the next election, but we're extraordinarily efficient in dealing with business and the needs of business in the crisis we've been through. It looks like we're facing another crisis, and it looks like the hospitality industry is going to take a terrible hit over the next month. Is there anything in your current budget or in the incoming budget to provide some form of support to the hotels and restaurants who are going to face an awful situation if things develop the way we expect?
Well, the short answer is no in the current budget. I mean, we are operating on the basis, obviously, of the health and health advice, and we will hear tomorrow in the executive from the Minister and the senior health advisors. And we've been told that although there's huge concern about the transmissibility of the new variant, we've been told that what we're doing in the here and now and doubling down on that message and getting a cohesive message, which isn't always easy to do, as I'm sure he's aware, but getting that cohesive message and doubling down is sufficient in the here and now. If it gets to the situation where more measures have to be taken, then no, we haven't set aside, because if that was in this year, it may be something that, you know, we don't know as yet what comes back in January monitor and anything like that, so we can't bank on that we would have sufficient resources ourselves. We are in dialogue with Treasury, because I think it would be prudent and responsible of the Executive to plan on a various range of scenarios. That's not to say that we're going to be advised that further measures need to be taken, but I think it would be prudent, given the concern there is in the rest of Europe and in Britain, to plan and make sure that we can have access to whatever resources we might need to support any plan. And so we are in dialogue with Treasury. We have no indication yet, although we're expecting to hear something more of substance from them in the next day or two, but we have no indication yet. I know the focus at the moment is on if you like, boosting the booster, and so there may well be some consequences in terms of support of rolling that out. But in terms of any other measures being taken, they are not indicating. I mean, Britain and the government in London are really only catching up with the measures that we took a number of weeks back. They weren't there. They're now catching up with us. So they haven't indicated that any further measures are being considered there, which would necessitate support for businesses, etc. And so we'll continue to dialogue with them, because we would have to press the case in that scenario if there was a need for further measures. And as I say, we are operating on the basis that the measures we have taken to date were to prevent a need for further measures. But viruses and the variants are very unpredictable. And I think it is prudent for us to plan and scenario plan. But if we were to do any significant interventions, then we would need support, and we would be asking Treasury directly for that level of support.
Well, I'm relieved to hear that, because the answer you gave to Stephen Dunn, one of the MLAs, albeit 10 days ago, was not as positive. But as you can see, things look like they're moving very fast in the wrong direction. So I'm relieved to hear that at least you're pushing on the door on that one. But on the more general issue of the current budget, or the budget that you're putting out for consultation, you know there's been a bit of friction within the executive. It's well known. And I think the executive are united in the proposal to give extra money to health. I think everyone accepts that. Health is more than half of the entire budget. It has the capacity to gobble up vast amounts of money. And just, it's insatiable. And that's any health service where it's free at the point of demand, and the demand is practically unlimited. That's bound to happen. And my reading of what's happening in the executive, and this is in the public domain, is that some ministers are concerned about asking to make a 2% efficiency saving without precise information as to how health is going to spend the extra money. Are you having discussions with the Department of Health to see if they can provide the focus that ministers so desperately need on that spending? Because an extra 2% in health is an awful lot of money. An awful lot of money.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the point and I accept that. And, I mean, I think it was said, I'm not sure who said that there was no plans attached to this. Of course there are. The plans for elective care, getting rid of waiting lists, are already out there and costed. The plan for cancer services is out there and costed. The plan for mental health strategy is out there and costed. The plan for transformation, that 147 million, is been funded in full as well. But you're quite right, executive colleagues, as well as supporting that priority, recognise that in public finances terms, health continues to eat up and would. I mean, what we have proposed for health is not what health asked for. Health would have asked for and taken much more than that. We had to strike a balance between what was doable and also what, you know, in terms of the impact that had on other public services. So that's the balance that I've tried to strike in relation to that. And you're quite right. So not just at Friday's executive meeting, but one or two, because we have 3 or 4 executive meetings around this, we'd already agreed that over this 12-week consultation period, Health would come forward to us, and we will work with them. Health will come forward with a clear plan as to how that money would be spent, that additional money would be spent, how it would be benchmarked, what the impact it would have, how it would be stage posted along the way over the 3 years, and what an incoming executive could expect to see from that. And I think that's a reasonable request when the executive colleagues are being asked to allocate a very significant amount of money, regardless of whether from their departments or not, but a significant amount of additional money to health, to the public who we're responsible to want a clear sense, what's that going to achieve, when's it going to be achieved, what's the time frame and how is it going to be spent. And so we had already agreed before even Friday's discussion and agreement to put out the draft budget that we would get that information over that 12-week period, and when it comes to the final budget decision from the executive, that would be on the basis of very clear information.
Do you think that that process has reassured ministers who are concerned about giving up part of the budget?
Well, we haven't seen that plan as yet, but we have agreed, as I say, prior even to Friday's discussion, we'd agreed that that's what we would do. And I mean, bear in mind, this is a consultation exercise on a draft budget. There's no, and he's been in executives before, there's nobody asked to put up their hands for a final budget at this stage. So executive ministers will have a general sense of what we want to do, which is to support health, and then they'll want to see the detail, and when it comes to the final stage they will want all the information available to them to say, and they also, part of that detail is the feedback from the public, from committees, from other organisations. That's part of the detail. That's the purpose of consultation, is to see, are we on the right track, and are there specific areas that we hadn't thought of, or are there improvements can be made over that 12-week period that we can bring to the final budget discussion. So, of course, I recognise at the outset the idea of anybody surrendering money, even through efficiency savings, is a challenge, as a consequence of 10 years of austerity. That's a bigger challenge, because people have been fighting efficiencies over the last 10 years and are down to the bone at this stage, and we recognise that. And of course that's going to make people more anxious and more unsettled in relation to that. But I expect that we will be fully informed and take decisions eyes wide open when it comes to final budget stage.
Thank you. This isn't a walkout, by the way. I've just got an important document to sign outside.
Very important. Keith.
Okay, thanks, Chair, and thanks, Minister, and the rest for coming along. My questions are relating to breaking parity. I think that committee had wrote to yourself, Minister, regarding the parental bereavement leave bill. So I suppose the question is, does that concern you, that bill, or breaking party in general? And if we have any evidence of risk with that, whether it be here or indeed Whitehall going after other devolved areas for breaking party, has that happened? And is it a risk that you're concerned about? Not only this bill, but generally?
In the coronavirus rates bill?
No, the parental bereavement bill.
Yeah.
So there's a...
Oh, yes, sorry. I'm not sure, maybe Joanne could pick that up.
I can come in on that. I suppose that there's two parts to break parity. Firstly, if we break parity for something that's funded through AMI, then we take the cost of that on our DAL. The other part of it, which I think is the part you're referring to, whereas if we do something which breaks parity and then other either devolved administrations or England have to come in and do something similar, the statement of funding policy is clear that the body who makes the decision takes the cost. I'm not aware of that ever having happened before. That's not to say that there's not a risk that it would, but if that risk was to emerge, I think then we would be taking legal advice on that.
Yeah, and that's to be fair what you've indicated in that note.
I think while that risk always exists, I would be right in saying there's never been applied ever, even where people have broken party. It has never been followed through in terms of that. But we have to, in terms of giving advice, have to say that the risk exists.
Okay.
Just a quick one too. Joanne, did we previously, when we went into super parity, was there anything pushback from? Because I've never.
No, there never has been. And if you think of the welfare mitigations, that's a key example of when we've broken parity. We've taken the cost for those in the DAL, but other jurisdictions haven't been forced to put the same measures in place. So I think that gives a degree of comfort around that risk. But the risk always exists, so we have to warn about it.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thanks for that. Next question is relating to your, Minister, you referred to your 18th of November roundtable regarding this rates bill. How did that go, and what was the outcome from that roundtable, and who were you discussing with? And I presume you put your point across, obviously. So how did that come back from the stakeholders? I think
it was a good discussion. It was the various representatives of business sectors, retail, NI, manufacturing, a small business federation, and various. I think there was about 8 or 10. Sort of the Hotels Federation as well were in on it. Some people, of course, as always happens in these meetings, have other issues that they want to raise with you, and we did get some of that. But I explained it. I think there is a sense, and I mean, I was saying when I was talking in the chamber to this, the core of this is that the legislation wasn't designed for the purpose of seeking compensation in relation to a pandemic. It was designed for the purpose of seeking compensation for specific circumstances which affected a restricted kind of geographical area. And businesses here were better compensated for the lockdown than they would have been had they been in England, Scotland or Wales. So we give a more generous compensation package, which I was glad we were able to do. And so there would have been a question then, in terms of all of the other public services that we're struggling with, as you will know, if we were then, through some legislative loophole, to have to compensate again that for which businesses were already compensated. So I think, to be quite honest, I didn't get any real pushback from them. I don't want to represent people's views, but
accepting your position, I presume.
Yeah, to give you a general sense, I didn't get any real sense of pushback. A lot of the organisations have either parent organisations or related to organisations in Britain, so they're already aware of this discussion, had already gone through, and it's now gone for royal assent, I think, in Westminster. So there had already been, some of them who had been kept informed of matters happening across the water were well informed. There hadn't been any pushback there either. There was some quibble, I think, in the House of Lords about some aspects of it, but I think in general terms there hadn't been any pushback there. So, I don't want to characterise all of the reasons as a broad sense, but no, I didn't come away from that feeling that we have significant consternation around this. I had actually had on the side, because I was doing some work outdoors this morning, meeting people, and again a conversation with a business sector representative who said, yeah, we've been up to the committee, we get that this is necessary, and then wanted to talk about other aspects of rates and what we might be doing in the time ahead. So I think people do get the sense that it would look unfair if businesses were actually through a kind of a loophole to compensate it twice, when we've such a broad range of public and private sector interests that we've been trying to give assistance throughout the course of the pandemic.
And then you discussed that in the chamber briefly, but the 1 month, we talked about this in the meeting, the 1 month and the additional 3 months. I think the 1 month cost £23 million for 1 month rates holiday next year, yeah. And that goes to everybody. And my colleague raised this the other day. Do you think, and appreciate that happened in the past. We could have this debate about the previous 10,000 and 25. Some needed it, some didn't. But at the time, to be fair, everybody got it that were eligible. Do you think that 1 month payment should be looked at to say, well, you need it and you don't need it, without getting picky about the different sectors? Or do you just say, right, everybody gets it at the cost of 23, and is that the compensation for losing this right to appeal?
Well, there were a number of considerations went into this. One, the Barna consequential was £50 million, and we did model interventions at a higher cost, and we had to set that against the consequences, or the context rather, of doing this at the time we were doing the budget, and we were asking other departments to squeeze, essentially. So I thought it would be unfair to go to the executive and ask for additional money for something the Department of Finance was doing, and we decided to stick then to the fund that was available, the 50 million, and not ask for additional funds out of the executive's budget, when we were discouraging other departments who were presenting very real pressures and difficulties in time ahead. We were discouraging them for asking for additional funds. So that set the context for the amount, because we had modelled it against higher levels. And then there is a factor when we initiated the rates holiday at the start. The first 4 months were actually for all businesses until we got a handle of how the pandemic was playing out, and it's not really in that context. There is, I suppose, a sense that if this is compensation for businesses at losing the right to appeal on a certain ground, even though I think it would be contradictory because they already satisfied as best we could at the time on that ground, then there was a question, if you started to target that, you would say, well, you're being supported on that issue of you're losing the right to appeal, but you've lost the right to appeal too, but they're not supporting you. And that's why we did 1 month across the range of people. We then recognised that there are businesses who are going to continue to struggle, and so with the funds available, we were able to take them through 3 months up to the summer period, and that's tourism, retail, hospitality, airports, childcare, some of the sectors that were identified under the University of Ulster study as the businesses most impacted by the pandemic. So that's generally the thinking that went into it. It was to use the amount that we had to do a 1 month, one payment recognition that everybody was losing a certain entitlement as a consequence of the legislation, even though I think it's justified, and I'm not one for removing rights from people, but I thought this was justified in these circumstances. So it's to recognise that, and then to support those businesses that need it most for 3 months. It's not a huge amount. It's 50 million is a huge amount. I don't mean in terms of those businesses. It's not a huge amount, but even in conversations with some of them since that, they recognise that and they're glad of that level of support to bring into the summertime when we're hoping that things have resolved themselves much better.
I think that's my 3, Chair, 7 minutes. I don't know which, but I'll leave it there.
Well done, Keith. Well done. Philip.
Thanks. Fáilte Road, Minister Agus Gurmagad. And you've said here today, and you've said in the Chamber in relation to the budget, that the Executive's priority is health, and that's a budget based on that fact. I don't think anybody could or should disagree with that being a priority, and I think that most people would have expected that and welcome that fact. I mean, obviously, when you do make a decision on key priorities in a constrained financial situation, and it has a knock-on effect. I mean, I would also argue that a priority should be the climate emergency that we're in, and green growth. And I mean, hopefully before the end of this mandate we will have climate legislation which will give future executive and assemblies a path to travel. But you know, in terms of the multi-year budget that we do have, you know, is green growth a priority, and you know, will it allow ministers in the next executive to kickstart green growth, which will obviously benefit the economy and benefit businesses out there, and also within the departments kickstart, you know, climate type issues and allow the economy to move in a green growth type growth moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, we did agree that the priority was health, but we also discussed a number of other priorities, and green growth was one of them. Skills and that whole getting people back into employment, it was another, because we're finding that there are jobs available. We can't get the people. There are too many people economically inactive, and I think the fix is to try and get people the sufficient skills to get back into employment. And we also talked as a priority about tackling inequalities. Now, in relation to green growth, what we had done was in a number, there are a number of departments will take the lead in this in various ways. Obviously, a department for the environment, agriculture and environment, the Department for Economy have a significant role to play, but there's not confined to those departments. And we had ring-fenced some money for green growth in the initial budget papers, and at a request for some flexibility in relation to that, we did unring-fenced it, and that was to allow some flexibility, because particularly people wanted flexibility across the 3 years as well. So when you ring fence money, it almost has to be spent, and if it's not spent, surrendered. So people wanted some flexibility. So that wasn't. Some people, I answered this question I think on Monday, took that as a sign of kind of downgrading the environmental and green growth issue. The executive have targets to meet in terms of carbon reduction, so we have to meet those targets across all the departments, and we're committed to those. So there is a commitment there, clearly, in relation to that. The purpose of not ring fencing was to allow more flexibility to deliver it, but also each department have a significant latitude in terms of internal prioritisation. So if there are issues that ministers are keen on and want to prioritise, they do have a control over a significant amount of their budget to do that, and that's why we took the ring fence off the green growth area, to allow people to make sure they could spread that over the 3 years. So yes, there's a commitment to that. I'd like to see more actions in relation to that. Some of that will require capital investment, a significant amount of capital investment. We're trying to work with people, particularly in relation to year 3, when capital is more squeezed, to make sure that they can meet targets they themselves have for that. But yes, it is a priority in the executive.
Okay, thank you. Another pressure is one probably facing NI Water. I know from my own constituency point of view, there are a number of towns and villages which have reached a limit in terms of development because of lack of water infrastructure. So, is there any intention, for example, to get extra money in the January monitoring round? How much water does how much funding does NI Water actually need, and how is that contained within the multi-year budget?
Well, I think in this year we did meet the amount that was required by the utility regulator, was it?
In the budget we have built in the amount, yes, and this year as well. Yeah,
this year's amount was met in full as to what was required, so I wouldn't anticipate, unless perhaps through increasing construction costs and construction materials, I wouldn't anticipate any increased demand maybe in January monitoring this year. But in the 3 years going forward, Joanne, maybe you could just update us as to where they are.
But Minister, if I could just update slightly in terms of this year, we are aware that there's a pressure in NI Water because of energy price increases, and we will be looking at that in January monitoring, but not specifically in relation to the utility regulator's determination. In the budget, we did fund the price control determination in full and ring fence that amount of money. And then, as the Minister's also said, the Infrastructure Minister will have the ability to reprioritise other funding within our budget towards that.
Yeah, we did put a paper to the executive 2 weeks ago. I hope it does get on for a decision tomorrow in relation to recognition of cost of living pressures. So we had asked for an early return rather than wait to January monitoring from some departments. Department of Economy had a significant amount of money to give back, and we did put a paper to the executive to try and get support out through the Department of Communities for home heating. But an added bit onto that was, I think, 1.8 million.
1.8 million.
1.8 million for NIW for the energy increase cost. The anticipation that they would come back for more maybe in January, because that's the only issue that I think does apply to that. But yeah, the price control issue that was raised was met in full this year. So again, it's like all other areas, it will be challenged, and particularly in terms of works which are capital related, cost of construction has gone up significantly. We're hoping that that starts to come back down again, and I think in relation to timber it has started to come back down again a bit, but there are always challenges there in relation to that. But yes, we recognise it's not just a matter of giving this to NIW, it's the effect that has in terms of the ability to develop, and for other contributions then to come in terms of development if they have the basic sewage and water infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. And then just my last question, specifically to the civil service in terms of learning lessons from the pandemic. How successful or how big an impact was allowing people to work from home, and is it something that can be continued in the future? And then subsequent to that, I thank the Minister for the civil service hubs, particularly the one in my own constituency in Ballymena. Is there plans for more of those as we move forward as well?
Well, I think Colin can answer this in relation to I know the Department of Finance, I suppose, would be gathering some information across departments, but our sense that clearly from the pandemic, and this was a kind of a trend that was developing anyhow as technology improved. You know, the requirement for people to travel in and out and sit at a desk in an office was starting to become, less of a necessity. And I think the pandemic then obviously accelerated that, because then it absolutely became a necessity to be able to work remotely. And so we invested a very significant amount early on, and actually, because the Department of Finance's responsibility for technology and IT support, and so there was a huge amount of work went into providing people with the necessary technology to work from home. My sense of it has been very positive, but Colin can give you some more detail in that. In relation to the hubs, that again was a process that had preceded the pandemic, and some of that has been held up. We're actually ready to open up, I think, Downpatrick and possibly Ballykelly, but we've been held back by the work from home directive. So they're ready to go, and some of the rest will be coming on stream this year. And I think they're important because they allow for that kind of blended working approach, which we're going to move to, where people can go into their local towns and work 2 or 3 days a week. I actually think it makes more accessible civil service jobs if you live in a rural community, if you live in a border community in particular, particularly for younger women. The prospect of having a job, we have to drive 5 days a week into Belfast, or we have only to do 1 or 2 days a week into Belfast, and then makes it a different possibility in terms of an application. So I think that will be of long-term benefit to the civil service in some of the areas that Colin has been touching on in terms of recruitment and getting those different experiences into the civil service. But in general terms, the feedback from staff in relation to it?
Well, there's been a number of developments. I think, first of all, in terms of learning lessons, I think the lessons were learned very early doors. So when you go back to 2020, I think lessons were learned 3 weeks, 4 weeks in terms of what was actually possible. So I would say by the end of June, in that first phase of that first wave of the pandemic, I think it was a very strong understanding that this could really go places with us in the future. And I know that DOF were had a particularly important role in that, in terms of looking to departments like DERA and DFC, particularly, who very dispersed and had already started to plant people working from home. Could they further expand on that? And this has gone right across the entire service now. So there is a policy which has been a minister has approved in terms of new ways of working policy. It's been through the whole consultation process with trade unions. It's been through the NICS board. Ministers signed it off. So it's ready to go. The only thing really sort of stymieing that at the minute is the work from home message, just in terms of where we are with the pandemic at this stage. So the infrastructure is there in terms of the whole culture about where people need to work and how they can work, and machinery, if that's there. I think there's a desire to make sure that we don't fall into the trap then of saying, well, if you're going to work from home, here's the way you do it. So it's 60% at home and 40% in the office, or the other way around. So I think there's got to be flexibility depending on which departments, which divisions within departments, and the nature of the work. And of course, we do know that there are some people doing frontline jobs where it's just not possible for them to work from home, just given the nature of that. I'll be fascinated to see. One of my jobs is to chair the people survey for the civil service. Our results are due in January, so it'll be very interesting to see. And we ask a number of questions around new ways of working in there as well. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of information emerges from that. But I can say to you, Connor's spot on. We've had a really overwhelming positive response by people in terms of working from home. Productivity, I'm looking at the productivity in terms of where I used to work, and it stayed very, very high the whole time I was there. I'm looking at the productivity in terms of where we're at this particular point in time. It looks good. You commented about the LRSS schemes and so forth. A lot of that was delivered by people working from home, so it can be done.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Alicia?
Chair, agus fáilte ród, Conor, agus fáilte ród Aaron Foster. You're very welcome, Conor, and your team as well. Conor, so we all know that the hardships that we have experienced this winter, in particular in terms of just living costs, and that with the rise in fuel prices and the increases in taxes, cost of universal credit, Brexit, the pandemic, and all these other factors feeding into it. What provision does the budget contain in order to mitigate against the cost of living crisis?
Well, as I say, we made one specific proposal at the last executive, and I hope it does. We sent a paper to the last executive. I hope it does get on for this week, because I mean, the cost of living crisis is on us. It came very quickly in terms of increased energy costs. So that they rose very rapidly in the autumn, and households are struggling with them. Then you had that double whammy of the removal of the universal credit uplift by Whitehall.
Just to cut across, that's the 55 million, is it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah. And we had asked for early returns in January monitoring to try and, but because. You know, if we wait to January monitor and we get a paper through it's the end of January, you're almost coming out of the winter at that stage, and we wanted to get that support out quickly. So we do recognise that. We also recognise, Alicia, and particularly in relation to construction costs, that those have significantly increased, although I say there's some sense maybe that some of the products are coming down again in cost, and that they all will have a real impact. So departments do have finite budgets, and we assist them through our own procurement side in our department to make sure they understand the challenges that lie ahead, to give them any assistance in terms of procuring goods and services. So you know, some things it's possible to mitigate against to a certain extent, and that will be in trying to assist households who are really in trouble. But some of the bigger global stuff in terms of big construction costs are beyond our control. What we have to do is try and make sure that when we're planning out construction over a long period and capital projects, that we recognise that some of these things are you know, uncertainties, and that people have to kind of build in that risk into them. I mean, anybody who's doing construction basically during the summer wasn't planning for the hikes that faced them in the autumn, and those were things beyond anyone's control, certainly in this jurisdiction. And so they do have to be built in as risks, I think, for people taking forward significant projects over the next number of years. But we will do all, you know, one of our priorities was about tackling inequalities, and I know the Department of Communities are very focused on that. So I think it's incumbent on us to do all we can, albeit recognising that if we prioritise health, that does mean tougher choices across all of the other public services that we provide.
Yeah. And just in addition to that, and I hope it's not regarded just as my second question, but part and parcel of my first one, I thought that maybe even VAT and energy prices and that might have been an instrument that could have been used had the Chancellor responded to that situation, you know, where it could affect everyone very, very equally throughout the country and alleviate difficulties that they have. But just having made that statement, can I go on then to effectively address my second question? The Derry City Airport, it's currently in financial difficulty, and being the mayor of Derry City at the time, Derry City and Staban, I know how crucial it is in terms of connectivity in the northwest. And in particular, you know, I remember at one time where an assessment was actually done that whilst the airport was costing roughly about 10-12 million, this is about 2016-17, what it contributed to the regional economy was 18 million. At that same time. So I ask, what has been done now to support the Derry City Airport?
Yeah, well, I think the last programme for government we agreed recognised that there was regional imbalance and that it needed to be corrected. And of course, connectivity is key to addressing issues of regional imbalance. So connectivity to the northwest, and we're obviously well through the A6 and the A5. If we can get it started, will be another important factor in that. I know there's consideration in terms of the rail line to Derry as well. But the airport itself is a very key part of the connectivity piece for the northwest, and we have supported it over the pandemic in particular, and they're grateful and acknowledge the support that we give the council who run the airport. They have put forward a business case, and one of the difficulties in relation to this, and we found this during the pandemic when we were trying to get funding, not just to Derry Airport, but to Belfast International and City, was that no single department had responsibility. You know, you can get Britain have a lot neater fit in kind of the Department of Aviation can do. So the Department of Economy has an interest in the airports in terms of the PSOs and various other matters. The Department of Infrastructure obviously have an interest in terms of regulation there, but no overall responsibility. So we have collaborated with the Department of Infrastructure and Economy and ourselves, and that's the approach that we're trying to take in relation to ongoing support for City of Derry Airport. The business case they have put forward needs assessed and needs brought to us then in the Department of Finance. And we have had discussions, I have had discussions with the Infrastructure Minister, and we are to have, I think, a further discussion with Derry Airport next week. I think it's scheduled maybe on Monday. and Derry City Council as well. So we are looking to that. The economy will be kept on board and kept informed of those discussions as well. And they have a business case to put for support over the next 5 or 6 years, I think it is. We also are in dialogue with London in relation to PSOs for them, and also we are hoping to get a discussion. It's been interrupted by both the pandemic and the interruption in the North-South Ministerial Council arrangements, but we need to get a discussion with Dublin ministers, and we are in contact with the Cabinet in Dublin in relation to that to make sure we can get that discussion as well. So it's a matter of what support we can provide, and we're looking at that, and then what we, in terms of support that the airport could draw from PSOs from London and other parts of Britain, and then in relation to what relationship it has with the rest of the island. It's a kind of a threefold approach, Alicia, we're looking at, and we hope to make progress on that soon. We will meet the airport people and the council on Monday morning, I think it is.
And that's very welcome news, Conor. And I've always believed too that the Dublin should be making a contribution to the maintenance of the rest of the airport, giving us contribution to that whole northwest region. My third and final question, just Conor, again is in relation to our health budget, and we all welcome the increase over a 3-year period, and we recognise it as substantial. But at the same time, I asked the question: do you think that that increase will allow one to address both the waiting lists, cancer care, and implement the structural reforms that are required and laid out under the Bengal report?
Well, yeah, well, we have agreed to fund in full the elective care plan, which tackles the waiting lists, and there was a costed proposition put forward a number of months back by the Health Department in relation to that. They have also a costed proposition in relation to cancer services and the mental health strategy, which we've agreed to fund in full. And of course, there is money there for transformation, and that's going to be the key issue. And that's, I think, some of the information that will come back between now and the final stage is how that money will be spent, what we hope to achieve, and how we can measure it as we go along. Because it's important. This is ongoing funding over 3 years, and we need to be able to measure its progress in terms of that transformation. So that's a big challenge, because the health service, probably more than any service, is suffering from the impact of 10 years of reductions in its budgets. And we have a system here which does need looked at, and there was substantial buy-in in terms of some of the plans, that particularly those which involved co-design and cooperation with healthcare staff. And I think we need to get back to those discussions and look to that transformation over 3 years. Firstly, because it's better serves the health needs of the population. But secondly, in terms of public finances, we have to get away from a situation where it's just simply a matter of finding more resource but nothing changing. We do have an opportunity over 3 years now to get some of the transformational changes that everyone has envisaged over the last 10 years, and we now have an opportunity to do it. I know that the current health minister is on board for that, and we will work with him in presenting a plan as to how that will be done and how it will be measured, which is important as well.
Okay. Thanks, Militia.
Colin, thanks ever so much. Thank you for your answers.
Okay. Jim?
Yes, Minister, you've put as brave a face as you could on the Fiscal Commission report, but it's hard to get away from some of the quite stark comments in it about doubts over the capability of the civil service to handle tax devolution, about the political incapability, etc. Could you first of all clarify, when it says that the executive didn't fully engage, are you disputing that?
Well, I can say firstly, it would be surprising if issues like capability and I suppose competence, given that some of those issues arose out of RHI report, some of them have been referred to in the Audit Office report. It would be surprising if the Commission didn't reflect on that and say there are capacity issues within the civil service. That's recognised, and Colin and the team that we put together in terms of working with Hawks and working with TEO are recognising and trying to move in relation to that. So I would have expected that to be flagged up. There would also be questions raised about the politics of the executive, and that, although there were similar questions that were raised, Jim will remember in 2007, 2008, when we talked about the transfer of police and justice powers, that there wasn't the maturity in the executive to deal with these issues, and this would be a disaster for the executive in terms of divisive politics. Actually, it's turned out to be practically the opposite. So there are always questions before things are done, and I think the Commission have, in their interim report, suggested a kind of a measured step-by-step approach, you know, testing some of the bigger items and some of the smaller items and considering how they would be done. And there is a long way to go in relation to this, because I said a full report at the end of this would be presented to an incoming executive. And if they are minded to pursue these issues, then that will involve a negotiation with Treasury. And I would anticipate it to be the latter half of the next mandate before you would be legislating for some of these issues, if that was agreed. In relation to the engagement, what I said was that at the time we were bringing this through, there were some questions in the executive in relation to what the approach might be. We launched the Fiscal Council, as you will remember, and we also then launched the Fiscal Commission directly from the Department of Finance. And I think at that stage there was a suggestion, it seems to me from my discussions with Treasury, to have emanated from the NIO, that perhaps this was too controversial and shouldn't be engaged with. And we did get an early reluctance from Treasury to engage with genuine questions of detail, of analysis in relation to taxation matters and other matters Treasury related. That has improved somewhat over the time, and I would hope that it would improve again to allow them to produce a final report.
Yes, but what I understand the Fiscal Commission to be saying is that the executive itself didn't fully engage with them, not the Treasury or the Chancellor's office, but the executive didn't fully engage with the Commission. Is that fair comment?
I think all executive parties did. Bear in mind, this commission was established by me as the Minister for Finance. It produces a report which I have asked them to make available to everyone, and they did in terms of the interim report. And a final report will be made available to me to present to an executive if it's within this mandate. If it's not, it will be up to an incoming finance minister. But the executive wasn't asked to formally engage with them as an executive. I think the executive parties were invited to engage with them, and my understanding is all executive parties did engage with them.
Well, somewhere they got the belief which they expressed that there wasn't that engagement, but be that as it may. You mentioned RHI. Now, as the Minister with oversight for the civil service, of course, you will want to be defensive of that civil service, but it also requires to carry with it public confidence. Whether the failings are in the process or whatever, an outcome signalled to the public that out of all they heard at the RHI inquiry, only one civil servant merited a written warning. Does that speak to you that there's a process failure in terms of discipline, or there's a level of toleration which is too high? Or why is it, do you think, that there is that disconnect between the evidence that we all heard and the practical outcome? Well,
I think the disciplinary process was founded on the findings of the inquiry rather than the evidence to it, because the evidence was something that caused concern to us all. But then when it comes to actually putting that into a discipline process and to implement that, it's based on the findings of the inquiry. So that was the basis on which the disciplinary process took place. I do have some concerns in relation to it. I do share his view in terms of public confidence at the outcome of it. And that's not necessarily, I'm not making any judgment of whether it was wrong or right, but I have asked for a review of the disciplinary process. I expect that to be concluded within the next short number of weeks or months. We've asked the Labour Relations Agency to conduct a review into that, because I think there is a concern there that we would want to look again to see if, as he has outlined it and others have outlined it as well, what looked like again, a stern disciplinary potential outcome from the inquiry, how that then emerged into a single letter of discipline for one member. And that's not to go over again the individual disciplinary hearings, because they have been done. and I don't think it's our job to re-examine all of that. But I think in terms of the process, there is an argument for examining, how it was framed and how it was carried out, and I've asked that to be done, and I expect to have some word back on that early in the new year.
Just one specific on that. Who signed off the RHI disciplinary scheme?
The RHI what, sorry?
Disciplinary scheme. Who signed that off?
The Permanent Secretary, yeah. The then Permanent Secretary of the Department of Finance.
David Sterling.
No, it would have been Sue Gray at that stage. The one for RHI.
Sue Gray.
The adopted process for the RHI discipline, Sue would have signed that off, with the NICS board.
I see. Okay.
The NICS board,
the final matter I wanted to ask you
signed it
about,
up, but Sue was late.
Yeah, a column said the proposition would have been brought to them by the then Permanent Secretary of Finance, but the NICS board would have signed it off.
Yes. The final issue I wanted to ask was, looking back with all the benefit of hindsight at the voluntary exit scheme, cost 300 million, 6,000 people exited, but yet they've all been replaced, so to speak. The age profile is still the same. The salary profile is still the same. What was achieved by the voluntary exit scheme?
Well, it's always better to look back with hindsight, but you don't take the decisions with the benefit of hindsight. I wasn't involved in the executive at the time that scheme was undertaken. I know the intent behind it was also, as well as I suppose reducing the number of staff that were required and the wage bill associated with that, was also to allow a transformation in terms of age profile, and we still have issues with age profile within the civil service. So
still the same.
But there's
the profile is still the same.
Okay, I'll let Colin pick up from there on, and that's just some opening commentary in relation to it.
Yeah, just to say that I think that would have been impacted pretty significantly by the fact that we would have had an embargo in recruitment for a long period of time as well, post-phase. So there was really a lack of ability to absorb new people in from the outside, and then whenever there were recruitment competitions, most of them were run internally. So you were effectively having the same people moving around the system as distinct from new people coming in. So there's been a drive over the last year from HR, with the support of the NICS board and the minister, to move towards external recruitment so that we can actually see that changing. It is starting to creep up in terms of age balance and age profile, but it is coming from a very, very low base. I would accept the figures around that are not particularly good. We are at a low base, and we have to pull that up as quickly as we possibly can, but it requires a new set of HR services and a new approach to HR, which is what we're trying to put in place. So Minister had commissioned a review of recruitment policy. We're doing an end-to-end review of the recruitment process, and we're bringing in a new target operating model for human resources in general, which will affect that as well. So there has to be a new paradigm here in the civil service for how HR is actually done to change this the way it needs to be done.
But does that mean that it was a waste of £300 million? Didn't change anything.
It may mean it didn't have the outcome that it was intended, or the desired outcome. I think, as Colin has said, it was hit where it collided with, I suppose, a general austerity approach, which meant that recruitment was put under a moratorium. So the ability to get the other end of it moving. So you had the people going out one end, but the ability of the other end to recruit, and particularly in terms of policy, recruit people from externally into the civil service to try and change that profile and experience and capabilities and that mix that is required, and RHI flagged up as well. Then they were all impeded on the other end. So I'm sure those who embarked on it did so on the basis that it was going to have that favourable outcome. There were other factors impeded that, but I think we're back on course in relation to trying to get the outcome that was initially envisaged out of it.
The other figures are...
Chairman, could I just sneak in one further question? In relation to the NIC, the National Insurance increase contributions, which I think is about 300 million, is that reflected in the budget?
There is a Barnett which came to health as a consequence. I'll let Joanne pick that up. But there's a Barnett which came to health and social services as a consequence of that. We have, through our proposition, exceeded that Barnett consequence, but I'll let Joanne McBurney pick that up.
Yep, as the Minister said, while the levy is ring-fenced for health, it does come to us in budget terms through the Barnett consequentials, and those have been factored into the budget. And as the Minister has said, we have allocated in the draft budget more funding to health than we receive through health-related Barnett consequentials.
But part of that is the 300 million.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Matthew?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister and team. Because I don't have much time, I think we've got quite a lot to go through today. I assume both the Minister and the senior officials will be happy to join us in the new year at some stage to talk in more detail about the multi-year budget. But if I may, just firstly on the multi-year budget, obviously my party have been vocal in supporting the prioritisation of health, but in relation to the across the board 2% for other departments and an across the board 2% for other departments in relation in the absence of a programme for government which presumably would lead to detailed prioritisation plans, is it the position of the department that 2% will have to stay come what may before a final budget is presented, i.e. that there will be no more detail on prioritisation and no more change in profile of that 2% blanket cut?
Well, firstly, I think it would be preferable if a programme for government was available to match the budget. But I have a responsibility legislatively to get a budget out in a certain time frame. So I can't really wait to see if the programme for government, as was outlined some time ago, is finally agreed on. My preference would be that it would, but we still have to move ahead. In relation to 2%, as I outlined, if it's not a question of whether it's the department's position that it has to stay. It's going to be the executive's decision at the end as to what the budget looks like, and then it will be the Assembly's decision as to whether they vote for that. But if people decide that the proposition we have put in order to secure more funding for health, not all that they require, not all that they would like, but that striking that balance between the impact on other departments and what is necessary to try and get health onto the right trajectory in terms of dealing with some big problems it has, and plus transformation within the health service generally, then that was the balance to be struck. And as I'd said, if we had decided to go 2% from some departments and none from others, that effectively, to get the level that we needed, you would have meant 4% from some departments, 2% none, or none from others. So the level of engagement that we had in relation to that proposition began during the summertime with other departments, and we asked them to look at a number of scenarios, of which 2% was at the lower end. We did get significant feedback as to what 4% and 8% would look like for departments in terms of their ability to continue services. And so our proposition, in my view, struck the balance between that which was required to get health on the right trajectory and that which with which departments could manage in the time ahead. That does cause pain, and we've recognised that, and I've worked closely with ministers to try and address some of the issues that they have raised. The central core proposition remains, and I know he has said on a number of occasions he agrees with the prioritisation of health. It's the question of where you find that. So if the outcome at the end of that is the executive decide not to do the 2%, then health does not get the money that it needs to do that work in the time ahead. So we don't get the money to tackle waiting lists. We don't get the money for the full amount of money that's needed for cancer services, or indeed for the mental health strategy. And the transformation funding is not there, and we end up in the same place we've been for the last 10 years, where the health service has just continued to absorb money to keep going without having the money to invest to actually transform things within it so it can have better outcomes. So that's really the choice that faces us at the end of this budget process, and it's not a question of whether we insist on that or not. We put the proposition to the executive. The executive have to decide, and I'm sure they will, on the basis of the public consultation, and then of course the Assembly has the final say in relation to that.
But you mentioned earlier, obviously, that one of the things you want to see in the consultation, or that you expect to be unpacked in the consultation, is more detail from the Department of Health on how they will. And to reiterate, I agree that health should be prioritised, and I'm very clear on that. But you do expect and want to see more detail, as you said, from the Department of Health on how they intend to spend the money. Is the corollary to that if there is also more detail about the specific needs and pressures on for example, other areas. Philip McGuigan rightly mentioned earlier on the need for, and I think you mentioned it yourself in the Assembly this week, the ring fence, for example, around green growth and decarbonisation, and indeed pressures on NI water. If there's more specificity on those in relation to the consultation period, would you be willing to look at that while still protecting the prioritisation and the settlement for health, which we all want to see?
Well, I don't think we suffer from a lack of specificity. I'm trying to get that out.
I can't do it.
I was just saying, I don't think we suffer from a lack of detail in relation to the pressures that other departments face, and that's not absolutely not to disregard them, because they are very real. And the Department of Finance suffers from the same issues. Let me assure you, I've had discussions with people in our own department about the pressures they face. We provide a range of key public services in the Department of Finance too, and we have suffered in that department from 10 years of austerity budgets as well. So I've no doubt in relation to all of that. The question would be, and I'm very open to hearing anything over the period, that's what consultation's for, is to hear from other departments, to hear from the public, to hear from committees here and the Assembly as to their views in relation to that. And of course, the purpose of consultation is that you are open to the idea of change at the end of it, and that's a matter for the Executive. But if we do move from the process, or if we move to decide that there are other priorities that we need to meet, then there's only one place that can come from, and that is the money that we have earmarked for health. So if we do decide that the issues around green growth, which we have given flexibility for, and as I said in response to an earlier question, that isn't to downgrade or reduce down in any sense the absolute imperative in relation to carbon reduction and the green growth strategy. But we wanted to give departments more flexibility about how they engaged with that.
Right.
But if we decide then that priority needs more resources, or if we decide that Northern Ireland Water need more resources, or TransLink need more resources, then the only place in our finite budget that we can take that from as part of our proposition is take it back from the money we've earmarked for health. Right.
Okay, thank you. Just quickly, because I don't have much time, and you've covered a lot of ground for us, so thank you. But on January monitoring and where pressures are in year, what's the latest calculation on how much what you're expecting in terms of underspend from the Department of Economy and money that will be for reallocation in January?
Well, we were actually attempting to do a reallocation now in terms of cost of living crisis and winter home heating support, and also some money for energy costs to Northern Ireland Water. And that was the paper that we brought to the Executive last week. The Department of Economy had indicated a £40 million surrender, was it?
Yeah, it was around that, yes.
Yeah, that would come in January. So we were preparing to use that and some other money that we had expected to come into the system, some indication from other departments. We also have probably in January the £50 million barring consequential rates, the rates legislation that's gone through Westminster. It will come to us in this financial year. The Treasury insisting we spend it in this financial year, and of course we can't use it for that rates purpose in this financial year, because that comes into play in the next financial year. And so we have, as I had said in the Assembly, that arrangement with Health where we kind of do a swap. We get money of Health on the understanding that we give it back mid-year to them. So that could be another 50 million. The things we know about, and Joanne can add to this, that certainly we know about, is special education needs have indicated that they have a requirement. Northern Ireland Water have further requirements in terms of energy costs, which we had intended to meet in January monitoring. I'm not sure if anyone else has indicated anything.
I mean, there were a range of pressures not met in October monitoring. We'd expect some of those to come forward, but SEN and NI Water are the main ones, and then obviously the developments on the COVID front, whether there's additional pressures coming out of that.
Okay, thank you. I'm given it's Christmas, I won't be too pointed in reminding Minister and indeed Joanne that we had made a specific call for money to be redirected, about 50 million to be redirected around universal credit to deal with cost of living, and I was told that it was impossible and an unreasonable ask, but that underspend now it looks like it's materialised. But since it's Christmas and in the spirit of goodwill, I won't dwell on that too much. My final question is in relation to the civil service reform piece that we've been talking about. Minister, there's a little bit of a lack of clarity over who owns the programme for civil service reform, and we discussed this a little bit with Jenny not Jenny Piper, Jane Brady and her replacement. Jenny Piper's gone off now to a different role as we've been discussing. But with Colm and with Jane Brady, are you Minister the senior responsible? Are you the senior political owner of the programme for civil service reform, or is it the First and Deputy First Minister?
Well, just on your first point, just to set the record straight, the bid for that was in the October monitoring round where we didn't have the money for it. And also, I don't believe that a couple of months universal credit uplift is sufficient for people. I believe it should be continued on. And since that, the cost of living crisis has become more acute with the increase in energy costs, and that's we were trying to move to trying to assist people in that regard. In relation to ownership of civil service reform, obviously it needs to be, and that's why we established an MOU between ourselves and Hawks and TEO, because there is an overlapping responsibility there. Hawks is the leader of the civil service. I have responsibility in terms of answering to the Assembly in civil service policy and civil service matters as Department of Finance, and of course TEO have that overarching responsibility across all of the departments. So it's not the case that somebody owns it in particular. What I think we need to make sure is that we all are very clear about what our roles are, and that we have an agreement where we work together with a central aim and drive, which is that longer term reform piece, with a number of interim measures within that, with a number of streams within that, which we need to measure and press ahead with us. Some of the ones Colm has already referred to in his responses, but that's the purpose of the MOU, was that we're very clear. When it comes to a question on the civil service, I have to stand up in front of the Assembly, or I have to do a written response to the Assembly and answer. So therefore I have a responsibility, but I'm not a total ownership of that responsibility, and that's why that level of collaboration between ourselves, TEO and Hawks, needs formalised, and we've managed to do that under the new head of the civil service, which I think is a good thing, and we're all agreeable on how that works, but we're also, more importantly, agreeable on the work that needs to be done in the time ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Minister.
Gemma?
Thanks, Chair, and welcome, Conor, and your officials. Thank you for your presentation. The joys of going second last, as most of my questions have already been asked and answered. But as we all know, you recently announced that the executive have been an accredited living wage employer. Does this mean, and I just for clarity for myself, does this mean that from next June, all public sector employees, even those who are contracted, will receive the living wage?
Well, the executive is responsible for the employment of civil service and those who work for the civil service, and so I think the impact of that policy immediately, and it's already in place and has been in place. The announcement a couple of weeks back was the accreditation of us for doing that from the Living Wage Foundation. So that affected immediately about 350 families, and then the people who work for the civil service, that's cleaners, catering staff, security people, then they're brought into that. The broad public sector and public service then expand across councils and a whole range of other areas, and teachers and other people who are employed in the public service. So our encouragement is to people to go down that route. What happens from next June, though, in terms of our procurement ability to influence that, was that anyone who tenders for a government contract will be obliged to employ their staff as a minimum on the Living Wage Foundation living wage. So we are heading in the direction, I think, where we want to see this policy apply across the entirety of the public sector, but we have done for those that we can do for now at the moment, and we will continue to encourage that. And I would hope, because a lot of private sector organisations do take their lead from the executive in relation to these matters, and so I would hope that that does have the influence on private sector organisations as well. This is a time when we're trying to get people into jobs. We're trying, every single private sector that I have spoke to, every section of the private sector I've spoke to, be it manufacturing, hospitality, retail, services, all want to employ more people, and they have to provide conditions that make it suitable for people to take up employment. The idea of zero-hour contracts and less than the living wage, I think those are just an anathema to trying to get people into employment, and it's counterproductive. to our economic growth that people aren't taking up job opportunities. So I would hope that we have led by example, and I would hope that that is followed through then right across the public sector, and I think that's an ambition should be realised across the public sector, but also beyond that into the private sector. But certainly anybody who wants an executive awarded contract from next June will have to be employing those who work for them as a minimum the living wage, standard living wage.
No, that's great, and thanks for that clarity. And don't even get me started on 0-hour contracts. You know, I have a PMB on that. So, no, thank you very much for that, and thanks for everything throughout the year.
Okay, thank you.
Pat?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, and thank your officials there as well. I take this opportunity of just wishing you and all your officials a Merry Christmas. I hope you have a good one with the new grandchild in the house now. Over Christmas, everything changes for it. Conor, I was just going to ask is, I see they're just looking through at the 5% increase that we have in the cost of living at the moment. And how does that work in and affect the budgets? And I know you must have to try and allow for that as we're going forward 3 years. I must welcome at least your capacity to try and go for the 3-year budget. I also, what Gemma, just to tie in with it on the low wage, and with those increase in the amount of costs we see it in our fuel and our prices, it's right across the board. It's driving an awful lot of people into poverty. I know there's 2 or 3 questions in that, but you have some powers there to try and alleviate that, and hopefully that would be across all of the political parties within the executive, because I do think, and I'm fearful of this tsunami which is going to hit us. Thank you, Conor.
Okay, well, thanks, Pat, for that. Yeah, well, I mean, the powers I have, and which I did try and act on over the last number of weeks, was to put a call out to departments to surrender early money that they wouldn't otherwise not have surrendered perhaps to January. And at that stage, from my perspective, we were too far into the crisis. And I know communities had a Barnett consequential of some 14 million.
13.8 million.
Yeah, just between 13 and 14 million to allocate towards cost of winter heating. And I think we had spent something like 50 million on that last year alone, and that was outside of the hike in energy costs. So fairly clear that that was not going to be enough, and that's why I asked for an early surrender. So that's what I can do in this regard. I can ask for an early surrender. I can cobble together a proposition and put it to the executive and say, listen, if I know other people will be waiting who perhaps didn't get satisfied in October monitoring and waiting to see other issues they can raise, and that does cause them some consternation because they're probably anticipating some relief in January. But I think the executive has to be flexible enough to recognise issues where they arise and be able to respond accordingly. And over the course of the autumn, we had a very substantial hike in energy costs, and that has a real impact on people's households. And we're coming into winter when the need for obviously heating rises, and people continue to struggle in that regard. So we did put forward a proposition that communities would receive £55 million with some money for energy costs for NIW as well, and that didn't make it onto the executive. So they're in my power ends, Pat. I can't get the papers onto the executive agenda. That's not within my gift. But we did present it to the executive, and I would hope we've represented it for tomorrow. I'm very hoping that gets on, because I think there's something we can do in the here and now to try and assist people, and we should be doing that where we can. In the longer term, we have the budget we have the amount we have priorities around health. We recognise there are more to health outcomes than the Department of Health. So people's living conditions and poverty and all of that cycle does contribute to ill health as well. And so, part of one of our priorities were tackling inequalities. I think that work needs to continue on. That's cross-departmental. And so when ministers are prioritising within their own budgets, I think they will have to look at how they can tackle some of those issues that do impact on people's everyday livelihoods. They also have to, in terms of those rising costs, particularly in large capital projects, have to analyse what the impact of increased cost of materials is. I say, although we are getting some sense that some of them are coming back down, and we hope that they will reduce down in the time ahead, but unlikely to come back to where they were. So those factors have to be taken into account when departments are decide their own budget. So within each department, the executive will decide the overall envelope and what's going to each department, but within that, ministers have a high degree of discretion as to how they prioritise within that, even though it's not all they wanted, but they have a high degree of discretion to prioritise within their own departmental budget what the priorities are, and we would ask them to look to that and to recognise the challenges their people are facing.
Yeah, thanks, Minister. And you know, Conor, within my own constituency, and it's not a trick question in any way to you, but sits the Maze prison or the Long Cash site, which is in that economic corridor. In fact, it's only about 3 miles from where I'm sitting here at the moment. I was hoping that some way that can be at least developed, because we need to be thinking of projects, which high-end projects for high-end jobs as well, because I believe the education our young people that we have out there can be better trained and matched, but there are a lot out there that can drive this economy on, and that's just one of the projects that I think could help to where we are here for all of Northern Ireland. I know that it sits with the Executive Office, but all pressure, now that we're coming to near the end of the term that we all have here, and we're looking back into election again in next May, we should be planning all of these opportunities, all of these assets that we sit on. And I'm asking you, as the Finance Minister, I'm sure you have a trawl already carried out of all of the assets that are sitting idle, which could be a booster to our economy. Thank you, Conor.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, and I certainly, not for the want of trying, over many years that the project down there would have gone ahead and should be up and running and yielding benefit to us, because efficiencies, and we're asking the department for efficiencies over 3 years, 2% efficiencies. Efficiencies aren't just finding savings; they're actually finding better ways to realise more resource out of assets that we have as well. That can all contribute to efficiency. So we have a cursory glance across our estate would see an awful lot of underutilised assets, and the Long Cash project is one of them, but there are many more, big and small, and we want to see, we are doing a mapping exercise in terms of the civil service estate. That will be impacted upon the kind of new working arrangements that we're talking about as well, that blended working arrangement. So we do have responsibility, because managing assets without them giving us any return actually costs us money. So it's inefficient, because we're managing an asset which isn't actually generating any return. So we need absolutely across all the departments to look at the assets that we have and how we can get maximum value out of those. And that can yield people the 2% over the 3 years if they go at it in a determined and an imaginative way.
Yeah. Minister, I know that I asked you, I think it was yesterday, yesterday, about the green economy, or how to try and build up that green economy. I know you've already mentioned it there and spoke of it to people, to some of my colleagues there earlier. That to me is also the ideal opportunity. I know you said that money was ring-fenced prior to that. I've been trying to find that, and no doubt I'll see where that is probably over the next weeks or two. But you weren't tempted to go again on it. I know you said that you'd looked at it. And on the other end of that question, when I look back over before I was even elected, and the Bagoa report, which is sitting on the shelf, I'm sure, of lots of other reports in order to try and tailor or try and look at savings, can these reports not somewhere be implemented or brought down or brought off the shelf, and started to look at how we can get efficiencies in order to stop what's happening in the health service, the money that's going in? And I'm all for the money going into the health service, but we need to try some way to make where we are in Northern Ireland to live within our means and to drive the economy forward, especially for our young ones coming forward. I hope you can agree with me on that, Minister.
Yeah, I don't have any difficulty in relation to that. The ring fencing of the green growth issues, the idea to undo that is actually just to give more departments more flexibility in how they spend it. It's not to downgrade it in any way, as I've said. And departments will be publishing their own spending plans as part of this. So there is an opportunity for all committees and indeed any MLA to engage with departments and get looking at their spending plans over the next 3 years as part of the budget consultation exercise. So you'll see much more detail across all of the departments, and there are very many contributions from departments in relation to green growth strategies, not just DERA or economy, but across a range of departments as well. So it'll be important to get a look at those. And of course, in terms of health transformation, we are looking at the idea that, those reports were there. There were some very important principles in them. They were now a number of years old, and of course you have the pandemic experience to try and factor in. But the broad principle of co-design with people who work in the health service, I still think is an important principle. So what we want to see is the health department coming forward with a programme for transformation to bring to the executive, so we can analyse that, agree it as part of the final budget, and get a clear sense of how that's going to work, and that people who work in the health service themselves are on board with that plan, and that we spend the next 3 years trying to transform as well as tackle all of the acute issues within the health services too.
Yeah, Conor, I'm the party, I'm spokesperson for small businesses, and going around small businesses, and I know that you're aware of them. It's like they're in round 9, they've been knocked down 3 times, and the smelling salts has been distributed to them. So we need to be careful on how we try to nurture them over the next 3 or 4 months, and any help that can be reached out to them, especially, I know that it may well come from the United Kingdom government, some form of relief on VAT, and on that which you have control over the rates. Yeah, well, of course we are acutely aware of that, and our intention in terms of taking the initiatives that we've taken in response to the increase in COVID has been with the express purpose of trying to prevent a situation where we get to closing business again, because we realise that even with the levels of support we give them, which were much more generous than in Britain, they're still in a very precarious state. And we don't want to do anything which would damage them. But of course we have to protect the health of the population. That's the first primary interest that we have. And if there are other interventions which come from London, we'll very gladly accept those and put them to good use in terms of business. But also we are looking at issues around rates. And I had mentioned the idea of a continued rates holiday for some businesses for 3 months in the new financial year, which I think would be very welcome for them. But also in terms of our own rates policy, we've been looking at things about back to business, small business rate support. All of those issues we're currently discussing out with Ian and his team, who will be coming in to you next in this meeting. And so we'll continue to look at that, because we do know that businesses will need continued support in the time ahead. Thank you. Thank you, Minister.
Okay, thanks, Pat. Just before we finish up, something, Colm, you said when we were talking about RHI and the disciplinary process, you said that Sue Grade signed it off along with the Northern Ireland Civil Service Board. That was the RHI disciplinary process? The RHI disciplinary process. Yeah. Could you let us know who was on the board at that time? I'm sure we can check that for you, yeah. Yes, please.
It's generally the Perm Secretaries, the Head of Civil Service.
Yeah, but we can check who
some non-exec people, isn't it?
Yeah. No, so just of interest, was David Sterling on that board at the time?
No, he wouldn't have been. I'm pretty sure he wouldn't have been.
Okay, could you check that and let us have that?
I'm 99% certain that would have been done.
There would have been a conflict of interest if he had been on the board, sign off.
That's not saying it hadn't happened. We just need to know. If you could let us have that information, that would be very good.
We can get that through to you, yeah.
Sorry, Minister, Colm and Joanne, thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you for having us.
Have a very happy Christmas and a safe New Year, and we'll see you all, hopefully with a well-consulted and happy everybody to go budget very early in the new year. But thank you very much indeed.
I admire your optimism.
Yeah. Well,
thanks.
Sure. It's got to be optimistic this time of year, Colin. Is it going to work? Okay. Thank you very much indeed, team. Thank you.
Happy Christmas to you.
Cheers. Thanks. Team, there were a couple of issues that came out of that. Obviously, we'll be writing to the Minister and the Department on them. Obviously, the one I picked up about, want to know about the Civil Service Board and who was on it at the time. With the timings with Sue Gray. Just want to sort of check on that. Just be aware that because the draft consultation of the budget is now underway, and I think he said it would conclude, or Joanne said it would conclude on the 7th of March. Okay. And the draft budget obviously has important ramifications for the executive departments. Is the committee content for me to write to the other statutory committee chairpersons, suggest they take evidence from the departments on the draft budget? We know that various departments have put through their departmental budgets to committees. I haven't I'm not aware of them actually examining the draft budget as it sits. So I think it'd be quite important that they looked at what was in the draft budget rather than what the sort of their departments have been requesting beforehand. And therefore, is the committee content to seek written responses from other committees before the 18th of February? I think that's sort of the timescale we're looking at, when the committee might then publish as a report shortly thereafter, and which, along with the Fiscal Council report, might inform a take-note debate, perhaps somewhere around about Monday the 28th. I think would be an appropriate time for us to do that if we were agreed. Agreed. Thank you. Moving on to the next item, chairperson's business, the Fiscal Commission, and you heard the Minister allude to it there. The Fiscal Commission has published its interim report. The Fiscal Commission will brief the committee later in January next year on its findings. The Commission quotes from a letter from the Chief Secretary of the Treasury to the Finance Minister, indicating that the Executive has not demonstrated that its finances are on a sustainable footing for the long term. As a consequence, it appears that the Treasury did not engage with the Fiscal Commission as readily as the similar commissions in Scotland and Wales, which I think is quite disappointing, and I don't think the Minister really got to the nub of it when he was in front of us. So, therefore, are we content to write to the Minister and the Chief Secretary of the Treasury seeking sight of the relevant correspondence and asking for clarity as to how long-term financial sustainability may be demonstrated? And just ask the Secretary of the Treasury, do they still have those concerns? Because I think the Minister indicated that in dialogue those concerns weren't there anymore. So I think we'd just like to have clarification of that, because of course that sits within the interim report by the Fiscal Commission, which has been rightly highlighted by quite a few commentators. If we're agreed? Agreed. Draft minutes of proceedings. There's two draft minutes of proceedings are on page 7 and 13. Members are content the draft minutes, both draft minutes are an accurate record of proceedings. Are we agreed? Agreed. Matters are rising. Peter, do you want to?
Yes, Chair. I just can ask Marion to, if you can just unmute the members when they're in the spotlight, if you can. Sorry, Chairperson, I just want to repeat some procedural guidance for the record, which I gave last week in respect of Assembly privilege. As members will recall, a witness to the committee chose to refer in detail to an allegation of defamation. This is as part of the committee stage of the Defamation Bill. The witness could have made their point without naming names, but they chose to name them anyway. I had no forewarning of this. Just to be clear, my advice to the committee is that Assembly privilege may indeed be used as a tool to explore sensitive policy areas, and so it should. But it should not be used ill-advisedly by witnesses or members to provide unnecessary commentary about individuals. Members shouldn't therefore be surprised if in future the chairperson intervenes before or more likely after these events have happened. So if members are content, I'll also add that to the minutes so that members are therefore definitely aware that they have received this guidance. Thank you, Chairperson.
Good. Are we agree? No other matters.
Can I just ask, Clark, if I may?
Go ahead, Matthew.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Clark, for that guidance. And I appreciate the Clark had to the position he was put in the circumstances means he's right and had to give us this guidance. Can I just clarify? It was the what has prompted the Clerk to give us this guidance was not a statement or a question by a member of the committee, but rather something that was said by a witness.
It's both. So there were comments by a witness. There was also commentary by members as well. And just to make members aware of what Assembly privilege is, and yes, they should definitely use it. They should definitely make use of that. But if you can avoid naming names and you can still make your point, the suggestion is that that's what you should do. I think Mr. Alistair might want to come in.
Jim?
I just want to ask, what's the basis of this guidance? Whose guidance is it?
That is the guidance. This is the guidance that we've been, legal services have advised the Secretariat about how Assembly privilege should be used. And we ourselves have then developed guidance, which I've just shared with members. So it's coming from us, from the Clerk of the Committee. But it's informed.
I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I do want to make the comment that privilege is absolute.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
It's not subjectively to be dissipated.
Indeed.
And I just do question the apparent attempt to place limits upon privilege. It's not a road, I think, that we should readily go down.
And to clarify, there is no attempt to put a limit on that privilege. Member's quite right. It is absolute. You're absolutely right. Just the suggestion.
Yes, but if the chair is going to intervene, isn't he going to be putting limits on it?
Just for clarity of the committee, Mr. Allister eloquently put what I was going to say anyhow, so that is now on the record. Our privilege is absolute, and in a democracy, and bearing in mind attempts to manage our privilege, I think is something that we would all treat with a large degree of concern, bearing in mind what's previously happened in this Assembly and what has occurred. And indeed, we've heard evidence from the Minister today about sort of RHI and various other issues as well. And that is one of the things we must jealously guard. And I think I've made that point, and I will take that point very clearly. With your agreement, I will take that to the Chairperson's Liaisons Group as well, and make that point very clear.
But Mr. Chairman, I think we all realise what the particular piece of evidence was about. I do not see how that point could have been made by Mr. McBride without naming the individual, because it would refer to a particular piece that was written in a newspaper, and if he hadn't named the individuals concerned, it wouldn't have made sense. And I think it was a very powerful indication of the restrictions that the local media feel that they have to deal with. So I didn't take great offence. So I noticed that none of the media used it, even though they had the privilege. None of the media named the person he named, because maybe they were worried about action being taken against them. So in Westminster, privilege is used quite extensively to expose all sorts of skullduggery. So, and it's not that as many witnesses come before us and use it. In the Assembly generally, it's not used that much. So therefore, I think we need to be a bit careful about throwing out one of the major privileges that we have, is that we can say, I can call a member a bounder, a cad and a lewd fellow, and there's nothing he can do about it, or she, and I think we have to retain that right.
Agreed.
Chair, could I make a further comment?
Yes, certainly.
I would like to know, is this guidance the product of a complaint, or is this self-generated guidance from legal services?
We will ask that question. I think
Chair, I can answer no, it is not the product of a complaint. And just to be clear, sorry, it's not coming from legal services. We have been given advice previously about the use of privilege. And as you will recall, at the start of every mandate, usually the clerk of the committee will advise members about privilege. So all I'm really doing here is reiterating that advice that you've had before.
Okay. And sort of on behalf of the committee, I'll take this up with the Chairperson's Liaisons Group, so people are fully aware of that. Thank you. Next item on the agenda, item number 7, Defamation Bill, Department of Finance. Have we got Michael and Martin on Starleaf?
Yeah.
I'm here, Chair.
Hi, Michael. Have we got Martin?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, Tim, the next item on the agenda is the committee now received oral evidence from the Department of Finance on the Defamation Bill. The session will be reported by Hansard. This is our last evidence session, is it?
It is. We have the sponsor of the bill after Christmas, but okay. This is basically the last evidence session.
Okay. Welcoming Michael Foster, who's Head of Civil Law Reform Division of the Department of Finance, and Martin Tyrrell, who's the Principal Legal Officer, Civil Law Reform Department of Finance. The relevant papers are at page, Clerk's Briefing Notes, page 212. Departmental Response to Committee Queries at page 220. Reaction Protocol on Defamation is page 236. Defamation Bill table is page 240. The Raised Defamation Bill paper is at page 275. And the Defamation Bill and the AFM is at page 311. Members are reminded to ignore page 213, which is included in error. Michael and Martin, you're very welcome to the Committee for Finance. Could I invite you to give some further opening remarks to the committee stage from the Defamation Bill and the correspondence that you've kindly provided, please. Over to the two of you.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon. I don't know how much detail you want us to go into at this stage. I'm conscious of the fact that you've had a lengthy evidence session with the Minister and that you've furthered business. We would be perfectly happy to move straight to questions if that assisted the committee in any way, or we can speak to the paper that we've already submitted to the committee in relation to the questions posed to us.
Michael and Martin, just for the record, so we've got it in Hansard, so we can actually record it as part of the sort of evidence gathering process. Could you just quickly talk through to the points that you've raised in sort of your paper to the rest of it, so we actually have those? Thanks.
Okay. I think the paper sets out a few general points before it addresses in a little bit of detail the questions that were asked by the committee. I think the general points have been fairly well rehearsed, Chair. We're conscious of the fact that this is a private member's bill. It's not a bill that this department has developed from first principles. And in that, to an extent, kind of constrains us in terms of how we interact with the bill. I wouldn't necessarily call this, however, a usual private member's bill. Private member's bill tend to be brought forward when a member has a policy idea and they want to legislate for it, and therefore they can be typically prone to being drafted in a way that lacks the expertise that is usually associated with an executive bill. But this isn't really the case with this bill, because it's essentially a rewrite of legislation in England and Wales in 2013, and it's therefore well presented. It's a professionally drafted bill. Are some minor technical points that relate to differences in drafting styles between England and Wales and here, and one obvious flaw which relates to Clause 9. But it's clear that officials in Whitehall have spent serious time with the Office of Parliamentary Counsel over there in shaping this bill, and it's benefited from considerable scrutiny at Westminster. So to that extent, it's broadly speaking the finished article. If you agree with the general principles of the bill, and if you agree with, for example, the serious harm test, this bill appears to us to be well drafted. And if you agree with the notion that the presumption of trial by jury should be replaced, then the bill reflects that in a very adequate way. But I suppose the department's concern, which was highlighted by the Minister and in previous correspondence to the committee and by our earlier oral evidence, is that those sort of big ticket items in the bill are ones that the department has reservations about. Whilst not necessarily, we don't necessarily think that some of it will have the positive effect that the bill sponsor and those who have come to speak to you from the perspective of the media organisations would necessarily have you believe. We feel that the evidence from England and Wales is broadly unclear. On the one hand, we've heard that it appears to have balanced the scales towards freedom of expression, and there is now some sort of deterrent in bringing forward a defamation case, and that therefore has made the system quicker and more efficient. But equally, there are others, and you've heard this message, I think, very clearly so far from the oral evidence that you've heard, that the serious harm test has, for example, simply shifted the financial burden to earlier in the proceedings, and that expensive and lengthy pre-trial proceedings are taking place. And, I think it was interesting to note that Dr. Scott, who effectively acknowledged that this was a policy choice, he hardly gave a ringing endorsement in our mind to the serious harm test in particular. There are other aspects of it, that, for example, like the abolition of the presumption of trial by jury. And on that point, the Minister's concern, which he elucidated at second stage, has stemmed from, the very clearly important issue of jury trials in this jurisdiction. And I think it's his view that this is the most desirable way for a defamation case to be tried, a case basically heard in front of one's own peers, as opposed to the forum of a judge who might not necessarily be in touch with all of the various aspects which are important for individual members of society or the ordinary citizen. I suppose as the evidence has progressed, we've taken a little bit of comfort from some of the views expressed on this point. I think we would have expected a much more forthright defence of trial by jury from the lawyers who have given evidence, but they seem to be fairly neutral on the point. Whilst preferring jury trials, they seem to suggest that a judge on his or her own would equally be able to discharge that function well. So, those are the two big ticket issues which, from the department's perspective, we have concerns around. The other big aspect of this, of course, is Clause 5 and the whole issue of social media, and that has been a theme of our concern going forward. The committee, I think, has heard much evidence on the point, and the view which appears to have come across is that Google, Facebook, Twitter, etc., is where much of the reform in this area is needed. And we've noted the discussion around how to most effectively get those companies to engage to ensure that defamatory content is not transmitted, or where it is transmitted, it is dealt with effectively. We heard, I think, from some members the idea of a pan-European approach to deal with these matters to ensure that companies cannot take sanctuary elsewhere. And I think, as we've tried to convey in the notes to you, Chair, the Department's view is a lot of that discussion takes us outside the scope of this bill, and potentially into areas that are outside of the competence of the Assembly.
Are you getting any visibility of what's going on the online safety bill at the moment in Westminster?
No, I mean, the online safety bill is a much broader piece, Chair. When you strip all of this away, defamation is a tort, and it's a pretty narrow issue. The online safety bill, as I understand it, is developing themes around a whole range of matters, which may well have some read across into defamation law. But as I understand it, and this department doesn't have the remit, nor indeed the resource to have the remit in relation to the broader issue of online safety. But as I understand it, that bill will seek to examine areas which stretch far beyond the remit of any defamation bill, for example. But it's certainly one that we would want to monitor as it makes its passage through Westminster, and how that would impact upon the landscape here. But we do have our concerns about how effective Clause 5 will be, and any accompanying regulations, which I think we've noted that some of those who have given evidence so far have noted are yet to be developed. The onus being in the provisions in the bill for the department to develop those, but within the framework of Clause 5, which I think will necessarily mean they will have to be drafted on a similar line to the corresponding English regulations. And those do not appear to have been effective at all in England and Wales, and indeed there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that social media companies and other website operators are not even using the Clause 5 defence and are relying on other avenues. So we do think that particular issue on social media is one that requires considerable further work, and it's one of the main reasons why the Minister felt that this was not the best vehicle to proceed in defamation, and it is why the Department was keen to see how this area was developing elsewhere in jurisdictions that have reviewed it recently. So we're seeing a little bit of that in the approach in Scotland, which has taken a bit of a different approach from that in England and Wales. And it's obviously one that we're very keen to see also, which has been well rehearsed before, about what comes from the review, which we expect to see from counterparts in Dublin shortly. And those are points that we as the department are keen to learn from and to interrogate further. And it certainly doesn't represent a lack of original thinking on the issue from the department, but rather the need to assess and learn from neighbouring jurisdictions and use those themes to develop sound policy proposals. But those are a fairly high level, Chair, those concerns around the bill. The rest of it doesn't appear to us to be particularly troublesome. I mean, we broadly support the codification of the defences, for example, on truth, honest opinion, and the statutory remodelling of the public interest defence. And we don't see any obvious requirement to tinker with them. While there hasn't, in our view, been any apparent restriction on academic or scientific comment in this jurisdiction, we equally don't have any particular concern around Clause 6. And some of the other provisions, like the single publication rule change, are things that we can live with. And then finally, I suppose it must be, I would have thought, clear, or reasonably clear to the committee now, having heard the evidence from a number of people from both sides of this debate, that the supposed bogeyman of libel tourism has not really raised its head here in the time since the 2013 Act, as some back then had predicted. And on that point, Clause 9 of the bill might not really be particularly needed. But again, it's not something that the department would necessarily down a ditch over, and we're happy to discuss that again in the context of this bill. And we can live with some of the other clauses in the bill, which appear to us to be reasonably sensible additions if they were included. So, Chair, I mean, those are our general comments. I don't know whether you want us to look at the specific questions or not. Those specific questions we've attempted, I think, to set out reasonably detailed answers to in our written evidence. So if you're content with that opening statement, Chair, Dr. Tyrrell and I are happy to take any questions you might have.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Thanks. Matthew?
Thank you, Chair. I should declare an interest, which I had intended to do earlier again, which is my interest as Chair of the All-Party Group on press freedom and media sustainability. Thank you, Michael and Martin, for coming and giving us evidence, and thank you for what was a relatively frank presentation, I thought, and straightforward. Can I just confirm, in relation to the bill, you've talked about your view of some of the high-level kind of concerns or high-level observations, I suppose, or drawbacks to this approach, perhaps. But just, I suppose, for the record, it's worth confirming there's no this bill doesn't really place any particular, or does it, any particularly significant bureaucratic or financial, it shouldn't put any financial burden on the department, but not really any particular bureaucratic burden on the department either?
I don't think there's any obvious financial burden as a result of the bill. It depends what you mean by bureaucratic. I suppose our only concern would be that on foot of this bill, if it's passed in its current state, there would be a considerable amount of work attached to producing regulations in relation to Clause 5, which one of the criticisms that appears to be levelled at that is that those regulations are bureaucratic, are pretty complex. The framework of the see how we could depart. And then
sorry, Michael, you're just slightly drifting in and out there. I realise we're both giving evidence. I'm asking questions and you're giving evidence remotely, but I don't know if there's a mic or something. But it's just you're slightly drifting in and out, so I'm not getting everything you're saying. I don't know if others are having that problem.
No.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, if you just, it might just be that your hand's near a mic or something on your device.
Okay. Well, hopefully,
I think just the question was just about the bureaucratic. You mentioned Clause 5 and how that might lead to work for the department.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to know whether that is bureaucratic in the true sense of the meaning. I think the point I would make and had tried to make was that those regulations themselves have the potential to be rather bureaucratic because they will necessarily have to be drafted within the framework of Clause 5 if Clause 5 stands part of the bill. Mm-hmm. But other than that, I mean, there's no obvious other bureaucratic or any other issue in terms of the department. Okay,
that's helpful. You now you also mentioned the fact that you had expected there to be more in your, and I think I'm right saying it was you, Michael, who gave us initial oral evidence on this a while back.
Yes.
That the question of trial by jury would become a concern, and you confirm that. I mean, that hasn't been a particular concern raised, perhaps because there are very obvious concerns around trial by jury here, but they tend to be more specifically around criminal trial by jury rather than the more niche area of defamation and libel law. Have you had any other concerns expressed to you about the trial by jury issue in relation to this?
Well, I think it's not really my intention to rehearse our previously outlined reservations around that.
Yeah.
And there's two aspects to it, Chair, and those are that there's the higher level. I think the Rolls-Royce approach within defamation cases would be that a defamation case would be heard by one's peers. The concern that the Minister has, and which the Department has conveyed to the committee, is that if you leave it to a judge alone, is a judge the person who is most in touch with everyday life? And in that person's hand, that judge's hand, the determination of what constitutes serious harm. So I think you have to take both of the major changes to potential major changes to defamation law hand in hand, the serious harm test, and then placing that serious harm test with a judge sitting alone as opposed to a jury of one's peers. Really, we can only, from what we have seen so far in the oral evidence and the written evidence, it would appear that the lawyers who gave evidence, who I think we might have expected to have been more forthright in their view that a jury would be the best way to approach these cases still, they seem to be fairly neutral on the subject, which I suppose is useful from their perspective. They are the ones who ultimately will have a much more direct and day-to-day experience of these types of cases and how they are discharged. We're still nervous, I think, around the notion that jury trials will wither on the vine, because there's absolutely no doubt that in England and Wales, with the change, the similar change that was made there, that jury trials and defamation cases are a thing of the past. I think that is indisputable. The Civil Justice Review came up with a different approach, took a slightly different slant on it, which I know that the committee is considering, and we've referenced it in our correspondence, where a judge would be able to try alone defamation cases, and particularly complex cases. That's something that we think as a department is worthy of consideration in the context of this bill. But it's certainly, the issue of jury trials is certainly something that we think is not a straightforward case of saying, well, let's leave it to a judge, that's going to make it quicker and it will remove the chilling effect. That presents, we've got significant reservations about it, and the Minister has significant reservations about it.
Okay, it's one of the, I think it's fair to say that the only, the chair or someone else can correct me if this is wrong, but I'm not the most of the opposition to this bill that we have heard has been from libel lawyers, one particularly high-profile libel lawyer. But the argument has been made to us repeatedly that the effect of Northern Ireland's, in a sense, relatively less codified libel regime is a chilling effect on the media here. Not a single media representative, whether they represent local newspapers or, we have asked, and I've engaged with in my other role, I should say, which I declare that interest, from the smallest weekly newspaper publisher to the BBC, which is one of the biggest media organisations in the world, consistently give us evidence that the Northern Ireland libel law regime has a chilling effect on their work and their reporting. Isn't that by itself a large sort of quite convincing evidence that the chilling effect does exist? And if the downside to passing this law is some of the, slightly more, some of the concerns you have expressed, which do not seem to be existential or profoundly problematic. The downside seems to be relatively limited, but the upside would seem to me to be a much more confidence in media to report without fear of being forced into financial ruin. I realise I'm not asking you to endorse every part of that statement, but I'm just asking you to, I guess, comment on the overwhelming nature of the evidence from media, large and small, that the libel law regime here is extremely has a particular chilling effect on their work.
I mean, I can fully understand that. It's an entirely legitimate policy position from which to approach this. It's probably not particularly surprising that it is the media organisations who are pressing for this change. the chilling, I mean, I suppose what I'd say is the chilling effect on the media appears to centre around the fact that the existing law promotes an environment in which strategic litigation can take place, and this is the material that you would have heard from Sam McBride in particular around the threatening letter to the publisher or author, and the department notes that evidence, and whilst it is anecdotal in some ways, we don't have any reason to dispute that that type of thing takes place. The question is whether this bill will improve the lot of the publisher or author. Will Clause 1, for example, mean that pre-action letters will be less common? And I think you heard from Paul Tweed in particular that he didn't feel that that aim will necessarily be borne out in practice. And one of the themes that appears to have been emerging, which the department has reservations around, is the experience of the 2013 Act. And that is the issue there of what constitutes serious harm appears to be litigated at almost as by way of a mini trial, in which the costs involved are simply shifted and they're not extinguished, and they're basically occurring earlier in the process. And we note and share the concerns which were outlined by the Gillen Review, for example, that the question of seriousness appears to become such a preliminary trial in many cases in England and Wales, and the costs they highlighted in their paper as following that, where one case I think the costs were 450,000 and another 400,000. That if the aim there was to simplify and reduce costs, there's a question mark at least around whether Section 1 has achieved that there. And just to taper that one off, it's also worth noting that since the 2013 Act was brought in, Dr. Scott himself studied the issue of delay, and he found that prior to the introduction of the 2013 Act, the mean number of days to determine meaning in a defamation case was 499 days, and it was suggested that would change dramatically under the Act, with the end of the trial by jury and the prospect of an early judicial hearing on meaning and serious harm and any factor or comment questions that arise. But he found that post 2013, the average time taken had actually risen to 698 days. So those are the types of things that I think we're concerned about from a departmental level, that we can see and we can understand where the media organisations are coming from here. From an academic perspective, if you raise the bar for a defamation case from or up to serious harm, one would expect them to have that additional comfort where they think that they can press on in a more secure way. But I think we have reservations about how that will play out in practice. And when we hear things like Paul Tweed saying he might relocate to this jurisdiction, if this Act comes in, that in itself brings with it an attendant grave nervousness from our perspective as to whether the bill will achieve the aims that it's hoping to.
But isn't he already here? I mean, it's not like he's. It's clearly, obviously, he does lots of his work, as he said. I don't want to focus on one in particular lawyer, but he does lots of his work in London and Dublin. But that's a product of the fact that more of his clients are there because they're much bigger economic centres than Belfast is. But the point, I suppose, the final point here before I let others in is, isn't the point that the idea about costs being moved earlier in the process? I suppose the counter to that is, first of all, we don't have data about how disputes are settled before writs are ever issued, and this is one of the big points that's repeatedly made to us, that lots of things are getting settled not much earlier in the process than is happening in England and Wales. In many cases here, it's happening privately before writs are issued, based on conversations between libel lawyer and legal lawyer at X media company and their insurance company, and it's being settled in the case of one notorious example which was outlined to us, for where you would imagine and you would certainly hope that if it was tested in court, it would in no way by either a jury or but certainly not a judge would it ever meet any, not even a serious harm test, but any reasonable common law threshold for defamation, but the problem is, in too many cases, it's not getting to that point. At the minute, we just seem to have this huge world of pre-action settlement that is simply happening behind closed doors.
And I think you've probably summarised quite efficiently the difficulty that policymakers have in this area, because there simply isn't that obvious evidence base from which to make these decisions. I don't think that I can honestly stand or speak in front of you today and say that there isn't an issue around those types of matters. It's how they're dealt with and how they're dealt with effectively. And it does, I mean, as Dr. Scott indicated in his evidence, it boils down to what is, broadly speaking, a binary policy choice. You either take the view that the serious harm test will help in those cases, or you say that, well, the evidence in England and Wales doesn't necessarily show that. And I think that's a matter that this committee will need to wrestle with.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Michael, for your evidence.
Thanks, Matthew. Jim?
Yeah, thank you. So, is it a fair summation to say that the department heard nothing in the evidence to change their attitude to this bill? Is that a fair summation?
Broadly speaking, yes.
The one issue I did want to then... Sorry?
No, absolutely.
The one issue I did want to ask your opinion about was, during the discussion about triviality in defamation, attention was drawn to the fact of the apparent inadequacy of the county court jurisdiction, where it is only £3,000, which is a much, much cheaper, cost-limited option. Does the department have a view on whether or not it's time to bring that jurisdiction up to a more credible level and thereby create the capacity to deal with a lot smaller liable cases in a very cost-effective way?
I think that it's an entirely sensible proposal, and I'm aware that the Department of Justice is and has issued consultation this year which specifically deals with the issue of raising the county court limit for defamation cases from the existing £3,000. Now, I think the figure that it was recommending was 10,000. I've seen in other areas that a figure of 30,000 has even been
certainly, even at 10, but certainly at 30, it would enable small, even semi-moderate defamation cases to be disposed of at a very limited cost, both for the plaintiff and the defendant.
I can't find anything to disagree with that at all.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much. And any more questions? Okay, Michael Martin, thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much indeed for answering the committee's evidence. I think that concludes our evidence taking on the...
Sorry, Melissa, I think there's a
question. Oh, so Melissa? Sorry, apologies, Melissa. You disappeared.
Melissa, do you
have a question?
I think you've muted yourself, Melissa. There we go.
Okay, thank you, Chair. It was Fatcher, Michael and Martin. You're both very welcome. Just one question. The Minister said that the Department was preparing its own legislation. In what way would the Department view the current laws to be inadequate? And does the private members bill deal with any issues which the Department would also seek to deal with?
Thanks very much. I don't think it's quite right that we're preparing our own legislation. As I think we noted in our letter to the committee, we've certainly undertaken some work on defamation law generally, but that work was not at a stage where the extensive policy development required to shape a piece of legislation would have been ready for consideration by ministers. That said, I think the second part of your question, which relates to this particular bill, I mean, there are aspects of this bill that we probably, if we were starting a bill for first principles ourselves, that we would take forward. As I indicated in my opening remarks, the material around the defences appears to us to be relatively non-controversial. In some ways, they're putting on a statutory footing and giving a bit more certainty and clarity around what the defences are in relation to defamation, even though arguably they don't really change things in a particularly obvious way. So, for example, the defence of truth at clause 2 in the bill is largely the same as the common law defence of justification, and nothing appears to have happened since the 2013 Act to suggest that the courts are not simply applying the principles that used to be applied in relation to a plea of justification to a plea of truth. So, you know, some of this bill has got some modest use, in our opinion. If we were taking this forward from first principles, we would need to think very carefully about the big ticket issues around serious harm. The Minister has expressed his reservations around that. We're concerned in relation to serious harm about how that will impact upon ordinary citizens. The Minister has espoused his concerns already around jury trials, and we also do not think that the bill is particularly well tailored to the challenge of social media and the provisions in Clause 5. So I think that those are the areas that we would, if we were bringing forward our own bill, we would look to develop in more detail and to test. But you know, if this bill passes, whether amended or not, our work around, particularly, I think the emerging challenge of social media will necessarily continue, albeit that there will be a body of legislation potentially on the statute books, which will deal with some of the other core elements of defamation law.
Very good. And I noticed just the emphasis being placed on another question earlier on in relation to the support for the bill from all the various media outlets and so on, or media sources. But then again, I'm inclined to think to myself, sure, they would say that, wouldn't they? And I think you implied something similar. But just finally, there's a current review of defamation law, and that happened in the Republic as well. And are you informed about that? To what extent? And is there anything that you'd hope to learn from that review?
Well, I'll deal with two separate points there. I mean, in terms of the media organisations, I would want to make it very clear that it is an entirely legitimate policy position to arrive at in terms of strengthening those proposals. And I wouldn't want to, in any shape or form, make it seem that that's not an entirely plausible position with which to approach this Act. In relation to the Dublin work, as I think I've said before, this is something that we would want to put into the pot, if you like, along with potentially a review of the Defamation Act itself in England and Wales, along with the very recent Scottish legislation, which we think is interesting. And the work in Dublin will probably represent the most up-to-date thinking on this. I'd maybe just ask Martin to come in there, because I think Martin is a better feel for where exactly we are with the Dublin review. Martin, if you want to say a few words on that.
With the Dublin review, we've been waiting patiently, and hopefully our patience will be rewarded. Our interest in the Dublin review is that we're dealing in the 2013 Act with an Act that is now 8, going on 9 years old, and the Scott report, which included proposed legislation at the time, it's now 5, 6 years old. So the Dublin report is useful because it's up to the minute and will possibly have more to say on the subject of social media. Our concern about social media is that it has never been easier to defame somebody. It has never been easier to damage somebody's reputation and to circulate that damage globally, literally globally, very quickly. And the comeback on that is often a retraction or a taking down, which maybe isn't great for the person whose reputation has been damaged. It maybe isn't commensurate with the damage that's been done. So we would be interested to see what the Dublin Review has to say on online publication, and also how it treats online publication. Does it treat it as a neutral facilitator? Does it treat website operators as neutral facilitators? Or does it suggest that sometimes they're more akin to publishers?
Okay, Michael agus Martin Cormail Maga, thank you very much for your very frank answers, Cormaga.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. And sir, I kind of thank you to Michael and Martin. Thank you very much indeed for giving your evidence. And now I can say this completes the formal evidence gathering session for the Defamation Bill for the committee as well. Members, have we any other forward actions wish to take place? So therefore, as the evidence taking for the bill is now complete, the committee will hear from Mike Nesbitt on the 5th of January. During the subsequent weeks, the committee will be asked to deliberate the bill and decide on amendments on its views on the clauses of the bill. Thank you. We move on, keeping all the members in spotlight. Moving on to item number 8, correspondence. Correspondence index. Members asked to note the index of 6 received items of correspondence at page 348. Item 8.2, super parity. And we've heard this discussion with that in the Minister today. The committee is asked to note a response from the Minister of Finance on the super parity issue in respect of amendments to the parental leave and pay bill. The Minister clarifies that if the Executive adopts provisions which are more generous than the rest of the UK, and this was subject to a legal challenge, leading to an enhancement of provisions in the rest of the UK, then in theory the Executive may have to meet the whole of the UK cost. However, this is subject to legal advice and did not appear to apply as yet to other devolved measures, welfare reform or any mitigations. We noted from Joanne, sorry, it's that sort of day already. So we noticed from Joanne when I sort of pressed her on that issue that there has been no precedence on it, and indeed when we've already adopted quite a few super parity measures and none of them have been challenged in any particular way. So I think bearing that and what we've heard from today. Sorry.
Matthew wants to come in.
Matthew, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Chair. I think we're probably just going to reinforce what you said. I think it's important that going forward, this thing around super parity, that there is a consistency from other departments in communicating what it means. I thought, actually, in fairness to the Finance Minister and his officials, they were candid and straightforward about what super parity does and doesn't mean, and the fact that it has never applied in a case where a devolved authority has chosen to give a right in law or make a provision, and therefore it's had a kind of repercussive effect for other institutions. That was the very clear suggestion made on the floor of the Assembly by the Economy Minister a number of weeks back in relation to amendments to the parental leave bill, and it was implied quite clearly that that there was going to be a £200 million cost. It has actually been implied by other ministers too, and I think there is something that the Department of Finance should take up as a matter, I genuinely mean as a matter of good practice with other ministers, around using this as a kind of go-to argument for not doing things that they don't want to do. And there may be very good other policy or political reasons their ministers don't want to do them, but simply making the kind of threat of super parity a threat which has never been enacted, and from the evidence of the minister and his senior officials today, is not just theoretical but largely unlikely. I think there should be at least some guidance from the Finance Department to other ministries about if you're going to give this advice, it has to be heavily, if you're going to make this claim or use it to stop to argue against doing things, it has to be heavily caveated, and it can't just be bandied about, because I'm afraid it has been in recent months by more than one minister.
Yeah. Just before I bring in Keith, just for advice of the committee, I took some soundings from our friends in Scotland on this issue. And part of their response to me was no. They, when they're doing super parity, they accept the fact that the cost will lie in Scotland, but they don't expect it to go throughout the rest of the United Kingdom, which seems to be a common approach across the other devolved administrations. Sir Keith, do you want to come in there?
No, it's good, and it's good to get the written clarity and verbal clarity, but I think it's only right, not defending any minister, but I think it's important that a minister gives you the risks, and it's up to us and whoever to weigh up the risks. So I think it would be incorrect if a minister didn't say there's a risk, because there is a risk. It might be small, but there's still a risk. So I think it's just good to get that on the record, but it's good to get it in black and white and, I suppose, verbally.
Yeah.
From the Minister. Thank you.
I think actually we should write, because if this is an important point for all committees considering sort of process that's coming through, that we write to all the committees informing them of what we had and what the sort of discussions we had today, and sort of pointing out the fact that whereas there may be a risk, not only is it minimal, but also we've actually had from the Department of Finance that it's never been enacted in the length of time that there is. Okay. Are we agreed?
Yep.
Great. Thank you. Next item on the agenda is Private Tenancies Bill. The committee is asked to note a copy of response from the Department of Finance to the Committee for Communities in relation to the Private Tenancies Bill, building regulations and responsibility for fire prevention measures. One of the questions that I asked when Peter kindly briefed me on this earlier on today, we were trying to work out, do you remember when we had evidence that came before us that the then interim head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, who wasn't actually a civil servant, but she was actually taking responsibility for tidying up the building regulations, and then when she left, it's now come back from the Department of Finance, but there are multiple strands to this and the rest of it. I'd quite like for us to write to the Department of Finance and ask them to clarify who does what, where and where on building regulations and where they sit. Because obviously next year we're going to have quite a lot of more building regulations and prevention measures are coming through. And I don't have a sense that somebody is actually the accountable and responsible person for this yet. And I think I would like to get that clarified. We'll also note from, I think it was a question to the Minister, and I think it was it Matthew, you asked the question about the issue about RHI and who was responsible for it and who was lead on civil service reform. And we didn't actually get an answer. There would be an MOU with multiple stakeholders and the rest of it in the finest.
Well, I think the point, if I may, Chair, is that the brief comment I would make is that it's probably too late in the mandate now. I think, and this is, I think that, to be fair to the Finance Minister, he's done a few important things on this stuff, not enough from my perspective, but there is a lack of clarity over what the Civil Service Reform Programme actually is. So there's the narrow, taking up the recommendations of the RHI inquiry, which we talked about and have talked about many times in this committee. And then there's a separate piece around civil service reform, connected piece around broader civil service reform, which includes lowering the age profile, increasing the capacity. That was mentioned in New Decade, New Approach. But it's never been entirely clear that there is one coherent owner, and that came up when we heard from Colin Boyle. We get quite a lot of kind of process and verbal organogram, which is fine, but ultimately, I guess the concern is that...
Sorry, what's a verbal organogram?
Verbal organogram, kind of just a description of what of reporting lines, which will make sense. I guess if you're doing a project management seminar, but isn't entirely clear from our perspective in terms of accountability. We're not able to pin down one senior official and one minister who's responsible for leading and driving through a programme of civil service reform. I don't think it's going to change before the election, but I think it's something that we need to highlight as an issue.
Can I ask a question of the committee? Because, much as the Minister was trying to be as open as he could, but I didn't get a sense that I knew who was actually accountable or responsible. And I don't think I've seen a wiring diagram. Now, correct me if I'm wrong from any other member of the committee, I'm willing to be corrected. Does anybody here have a good sense of who's responsible for what and who's accountable for what? That would be a no. Okay. So therefore, I think I think that's a valid point, and we'll look at that. But one of the things we will raise up when we're looking at civil service reform next year is we got to have, we need to tie down, at least for the next sort of mandate coming in, who's actually responsible and accountable for what on this issue. Because I must admit, having heard now from the new head of the civil service, I've heard from the minister, I've heard from the interim perm sec here, and I must admit, to be honest with you, I'm none the wiser. Okay. Next item on the agenda, the Assembly Commission draft budget. Members asked to note a response from the Department of Finance to the Audit Committee in relation to the comments on the Northern Ireland Commission 22-25 budget. Is the committee content to note? Noted. Next item, LPS trust statement about the accounts being qualified. The committee is asked to note the Land and Property Service trust statement for 2021. Statement includes references to qualification accounts in respect to certain COVID payments, including LRSS. The committee is already aware of the departmental accounts and has been qualified for the same reason. However, the other matters in the trust statement, including the high year-end debt position, which the Controller and Auditor General describes as concerning. All 21-22 non-domestic vacancy inspections were desktop exercises only, which I suppose is understandable based on COVID.
Actually, Chair, there's an error there, and it's mine. It's actually the 2020 to 2021 non-domestic vacancies. So, as you say, it's, okay.
As a matter for which the Controller and Auditor General is keeping under review, a significant increase in domestic and non-domestic valuation cases in hand, which the Controller and Auditor General is keeping under review. And we were looking at the detail of that, weren't we, Peter?
In tabled items, there's a letter from the department setting out the valuations. Yeah, the valuations number, where they are with those. Yeah, okay. And members may consider that when we're considering when we look at the legislation on the COVID rates issue as well. And the Controller and Auditor General qualification respective housing benefit relief overpayment owing to official error, and an anticipated Controller and Auditor General report on substantial internal fraud at LPS, which we are aware of, but we've been briefed about in closed session. Okay, is the committee content to note? Agreed. The SEUP's annual report on accounts. The committee is asked to note the special EU programmes body annual report. A risk of information breach was recorded following what seems to be a computer hack in July 2020. The report also refers to a review of simplified cost options. These are used in preference to paying on the basis of real costs supported with invoices and receipts. Payments are instead made on the basis of a predefined standard scales of unit costs or flat rates of lump sums as pre-agreed at the commencement of the project. Following an audit challenge, SEUP undertook a review of 7 of these. This led to funding of €23.5 million being withheld. 6 of them were subsequently cleared. The final retained payment is €11.4 million and is expected to be cleared shortly. So from reading from that, I take it that it was an accounting problem? There was an audit challenge on their simplified cost options, which they've now worked through. Yeah. So, and have thus been able to release the money. So problem solved, it would appear. Okay. Are we content to note? Okay, great. We'll note the letter from Sam McBride and the Defamation Bill. Members are asked to note further commentary on Mr McBride's appearance before the committee. Is the committee content to note? Agreed. A competent information request is page 481. Is the committee content that the competent request is an accurate, complete record of the committee's information requests? Agreed. Forward work programme is at page 495. Are we agreed with the forward work programme as agreed? Agreed. Just before we move into the appraisal of the private session and the non-domestic rates valuation bill, is there any other business? Nope. And date and time of the next meeting will be on the 5th of January at 1400 in here, in the great year of 2022. Okay, right, we're moving into closed session, switching the red button to Senate Chamber, programme sound.